Hey guys, you are watching your anime world. How are you all? Please support to subscribe this channel for watching new interesting stories. So in this video, we will see what if Deku faced smiles that could kill. Here is short summary. Izuku Midorya had no idea how he kept getting into situations like these. All he knew was that neither Kacchan nor Todoroki had ever smiled at him like this. Or, a silly premise gets not so silly, real fast. Villain. But before we start, if you want more stuff like this, then be sure to subscribe and like this video. And if possible share this video with your friends. Now let's start the story. Izuku Midorya had no idea how he kept getting into situations like these. All he knew was that neither Kacchan nor Todoroki had ever smiled at him like this. Deku, Bakugo husked, canines glinting in the low light of the dorm common room in one of the sweetest, genuine smiles Izuku had ever seen, let alone from the most cantankerous person he'd ever known. His crimson eyes were softened in a way that looked so terribly unnatural, heart-wrenchingly charming. Izuku's heart was going to explode. On his usually dour face, the furrows between his brows smoothed to nothing. In those eyes danced a mischievousness not related to anger or embarrassment or revenge, so uncharacteristic of his childhood bully and curmudgeonly hero to be that it practically gave Izuku whiplash. Midorya, Todoroki said with an equally genuine grin. It was so wide and impossibly bright on a face that never showed much expression at all that Izuku was blinded by it, squinting as if the sun had reversed course and burst back over the horizon, shoving the crescent moon aside to catch a glimpse of the rare sight. Kacchan, Todoroki-san. Did you need something? Izuku squeaked, pressing himself back into the couch they'd cornered him on, the two of them looming over him like cats over a patch of catnip, eyes fever bright and pupils wide. Bakugo started, settling on the arm of the couch and sliding his hand over the back of Izuku's seat. Wanted to see your cute face, Todoroki finished, blushing high on his cheeks in a distinctly covetous way. His hand landed on the cushion beside Izuku's hip, bringing him close enough to breathe the same air. Izuku thought his heart would burst out of his chest. He threw his hands up in the air, nearly sending the couch flying backward as his quirk unintentionally activated in a shower of emerald sparks. Bakugo and Todoroki stood up, watching with fond amusement as Izuku nearly sent them all tumbling to the floor. I appreciate the sentiment. But could you both please give me a little space? Why would you want me to do that? Bakugo laughed. His eyes squinted and his nose scrunched in a way Izuku wanted to immediately erase from his memory, because not only would it haunt his dreams, but once Bakugo snapped out of whatever this was, Izuku was sure he'd find a way to blame him for this. Completely unaware or indifferent to Izuku's inner shrieking, Bakugo resumed his place by Izuku's side, flicking a small piece of green hair from his flushed forehead. And even though the actions and affection were so drastically out of place, the confidence in that grin was all Bakugo, so much so that it couldn't actually be anybody else, and Izuku was positive he was about to die in the most excruciating way possible. The sound that came out of Izuku's mouth more resembled a balloon rapidly deflating than anything remotely human. I don't want to, Todoroki said, his own blush staining his high cheekbones so sweetly that Izuku was certain any maiden that caught sight of it would swoon right off her feet. His smile was gentler than Bakugo's but no less confident as he kneeled at Izuku's feet and placed a hand on his knee. He didn't take his eyes off Izuku's face as he rubbed the skin just below Izuku's pajama shorts with fingers just on this side of too hot, causing Izuku's skin to explode with gooseflesh and his spine to arch so suddenly it nearly shattered beneath the strain. Ah ha 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 ha, Izuku shrieked as he leapt away from them, scrambling over the back of the couch and backpedaling so quickly that he slammed into the opposite wall, leaving a sizable dent in the drywall. With his face cracked in half with the most terrified grin he'd probably ever produced, he lifted his hands straight up in surrender. What is happening? Bakugo and Todoroki straightened with mirroring expressions of adoration, one devilishly impish and the other unbearably innocent, and lifted their hands in unison, reaching toward Izuku like he was the most desirable being in the world. Izuku stared wide-eyed as pheromones seemed to explode from them both, roses and sparkles practically summoned to wreathe them in lovely beauty. Isn't it obvious, Baka Deku? Don't you see, Midoriya-kun? That I love you, they said together. They were hit with a love quirk, Aizawa-sensei said matter of fact, not even bothering to look up from the book he was reading. It will wear off in about a week. Izuku's face drained of all color, his smile twitching with genuine terror. What? He squeaked, so high-pitched it was almost inaudible. Aizawa looked up in irritation, his bloodshot eyes glancing between Izuku's pale face and the two enamored children glued to his sides like particularly affectionate barnacles. Like I said, a love quirk. The kid who did it can't control the output, but she says it wears off after a while. I'll give the three of you a pass for your classes while it lasts, he said noncommittally, going back to his novel. He didn't get paid enough to be bothered by his charges on weekends, really. He flicked his fingers at the hand slowly inching up Izuku's shirt. The two boys wrapped around him so thoroughly that he couldn't be certain whose it was, nor did he particularly want to know. Try to keep it PG, kids. Izuku's vision narrowed into a fine, panicked point somewhere over Aizawa's shoulder. A week. He wasn't going to survive, he wasn't going to make it. He inhaled sharply. A white band slapped over his mouth and shoved the three of them out the door and onto the pavement outside, Izuku stumbling as he tried to keep them upright while Bakugo and Todoroki refused to release him through the jostling. It's the weekend. Bother me one Monday, he snapped before slamming the door in their faces. TCH, Bakugo scoffed, pulling Izuku impossibly closer with his long fingers sunken into Izuku's unruly hair. Far from being put out by the change in position, Todoroki snuggled into Izuku's other side more, wrapping his arm around Bakugo's waist as well with a dopey smile. What the s his problem? None of his business, Todoroki agreed, nuzzling into Izuku's neck and setting his heart racing all over again. Izuku's eyes filled with tears. A week, echoed in his mind. He was going to die. Chapter text. It wasn't like it had never crossed Izuku's mind that Bakugo was handsome during that rare moment or two when the boy wasn't scowling or grinning with bloodlust. It wasn't like his heart hadn't skipped half a beat when Todoroki shared that secret smile of his with Izuku for the first time, and every subsequent time after. It wasn't even like he'd never dreamt of maybe beeping one or the other, or holding hands. And stuff. Even if it had been just a passing cough thought when Bakugo finally acknowledged that maybe Izuku might be someone he could come to respect, or when Todoroki asked in that shy, guileless way of his if Izuku thought they could be friends after they'd already been for months. He'd had those thoughts about loads of people. He had. Like Uraraka when she was being sweet, which was all the time, and Iida, that one time he was being super supportive. Even Kirishima had made Izuku blush a time or two with that friendly grin of his. And give him a break, he couldn't not appreciate Yaoyorozu in her hero costume. He was polite, not blind. So it wasn't like Todoroki and Bakugo were special or anything, just happened to show up in his daydreams slightly more often than anyone else. And don't get him wrong, Izuku was an affectionate guy. He loved a good hug as much as the next person. To have his hair ruffled made him giddy inside, little bubbles of happiness simmering in his chest to make him laugh. If he ever managed to get a significant other, he would probably ask for cuddles as often as he could get them, because who wouldn't want to be physically close to someone that made them feel good? Despite that, he'd never quite contemplated what it would be like to be so close to someone that he could memorize their heartbeat and become inundated with their scent to the point that Izuku wondered if he'd ever existed without it. Especially when he was 100% this can't be happening positive that it wasn't real. Maybe after several months of dating and getting to know each other would he allow, even desire, someone to get that close. But this was not what he had in mind. Kirishima took one look at Bakugo's face. He took a deep breath. Peef ha, oh my god, dude, I had no idea your face could do that. Oi, Bakugo said, glaring at his so-called best friend without much heat. Kirishima either didn't hear him or was way past the point of coherency. I mean, you look like, he devolved into silent laughter, clutching his middle and rocking back and forth on the floor. Oi, Bakugo tried again, scowling. And no, I mean, it's super manly to be so open with your feelings pftch, his sides seized, face tomato red as he struggled for air. Oh why, shut up, shitty hair, you're upsetting Deku, I'll kill you. Kirishima didn't even react as a shoe went flying across the room to smack him in the face, merely falling back onto the floor and doing his best to make his lungs work without mirthful convulsions. Izuku thought he could try a little bit harder. He groaned low and humiliated, burning face hidden behind his scarred hands. A sympathetic pat on his shoulder from Todoroki hardly helped matters, the other boy cooing at him as he would a small animal. It just set Kirishima off all over again. Oh, dude, I'm sorry, but I don't think I'm the one upsetting Midorya right now, he cackled. He tried to look Izuku in the eye, but couldn't, secondhand embarrassment dusting the cheeks above his muffled grin. Bakugo glanced down at Izuku. Yes, down, because he happened to be sitting on Izuku's lap, but Izuku just hunched in on himself further. Apparently finding nothing amiss, Bakugo smiled smugly before snapping his glare back at the cackling redhead. Stop laughing at Deku, asshole. What the air you doing here anyway, get out. Yeah, Todoroki agreed quietly, squeezing Izuku's waist and nuzzling the back of his neck. His legs were stretched out on the bed on either side of Izuku's hips, pulling him more comfortably into his chest and humming in content. Izuku let out an involuntary whimper as the movement shifted Bakugo who, did Izuku mention, was sitting on Izuku's lap and he really hoped that was Todoroki's cell phone. He's here because I asked him to be, Izuku said with utmost misery, voice muffled through his fingers as he did his best to block out this entire situation with denial alone. It wasn't as if he was afraid he was in danger or anything like that, but he really didn't know how far this love quirk business went, and it was the middle of the night and he was tired and he really couldn't deal with this alone right now. That's right, we're here to protect Midorya, you animals, Kaminari said with thick amusement as he pushed open the door to Izuku's dorm room, arms full of bedding for everyone. Kirishima just laughed some more, which was really unhelpful, and Izuku was seriously considering how much assistance these two were actually going to be. Asking Kirishima and Kaminari over had been an act of desperation on his part. It's not like he could have asked Uraraka, a girl, or Iida. Izuku shuddered. As much as he loved Iida, he could be a bit too intense sometimes, and this situation was already stressful enough. Bakugo scoffed. He doesn't need protection from you weak-ass losers, he's got me. Quote. Yeah, Todoroki agreed again, dreamily. Izuku groaned, well beyond done. He was dizzy at this point by how often his blood redirected to his face, burning perpetually at this point. Todoroki and Bakugo had refused to let go of him ever since they arrived back at the dorm several hours ago from their supplemental training, the echoes of their absurd confession still ringing in Izuku's pink ears. They'd rejected every suggestion for space and other than outright throwing them through the wall. It didn't look like Izuku was going to be able to pry them off anytime soon. You sure you don't want me to go grab Iida? Kaminari joked, giving a still giggling Kirishima a fist bump as he found a space on the floor to lay out their futons. Fatigue pulled at Izuku's overworked heart at the thought of straight-laced Iida seeing this. He would never hear the end of it, and he already dreaded what the next day would bring when he was forced to bring his two hangers on to breakfast for everyone to see. That wasn't even considering what Monday would be like. He was insanely lucky that he'd been the only one left in the common area when the two had gotten back. No, Izuku whined. You guys have to the count of 3 to get the hell out, Bakugo seethed. Was it hot in here? It was definitely hot in here. Todoroki, please, it's hot, Izuku whimpered, feeling totally smothered, only to sigh as the boy behind him cooled down considerably, soothing Izuku's flushed skin. Oi, half and half, here, Bakugo said mildly, placing Todoroki's cool hand against Izuku's flushed neck. Izuku eeped, but instantly felt better, relaxing. Oh, that's nice. Todoroki hummed, pleased. There was a collective intake of breath, then Kaminari and Kirishima were howling all over again. Izuku's eyes snapped open and he went rigid again, much to the grumbling of the boy at his back. That's it, Bakugo shouted, every bit of tenderness gone to glare fiercely at his two idiot friends. Get lost. He leapt from his seat and threw himself at Kaminari and Kirishima, ignoring Izuku's alarmed meep and wrestling both shrieking boys into submission. Guys, see come on, can we just get along? Izuku stuttered, raising a hand to cull the violence going on the dorm room floor. Predictably, Bakugo didn't hear a word of it, continuing his tirade. Izuku was just glad that they didn't seem to be fighting for real, Kirishima and Kaminari wrestling him right back with huge, playful grins. It was kind of nice to see, but Izuku really wished they would do this somewhere else. His head throbbed at the loud noises and he winced, retracting his hand to rub at his temple. God, he just wanted to sleep. It had been a long couple months if he was being honest, and he was really at the end of his rope. The relief of finally getting Eri-chan back coupled with everything else had worn him out so badly that he could hardly think straight. This was the last thing Izuku needed, for his two classmates, one of whom barely even considered him a friend, to fall under a love quirk and refuse to leave him alone. Are you feeling all right? Todoroki whispered into Izuku's ear, and Izuku jumped a little, almost having forgotten Todoroki was at his back with all the drama taking place. Todoroki pulled back a little in order to look Izuku in the face. His duotone brows pulled together in concern as he took in the bags beneath Izuku's eyes and the distress around his mouth. I'm fine, Izuku assured with a weak smile, cutting his gaze away from Todoroki's much too close face. Does it hurt? Todoroki either didn't notice that part of Izuku's discomfort came from Todoroki's proximity or he willfully ignored it, because he frowned and lifted his hand to Izuku's forehead. Right here. Izuku's breath hitched, immediately relaxing as Todoroki cooled his hand and pressed it against his throbbing temple. Why yeah, Izuku mumbled. His eyes drooped, fatigue bringing them down as he was comforted by the cool touch. That really was nice. Bakugo, Todoroki said quietly. Instantly, the room went silent as Bakugo jerked upright, Kirishima and Kaminari pausing in their laughter at the sudden movement. Bakugo's eyes narrowed at Todoroki's hand on Izuku's forehead and he frowned, getting to his feet. All right, that's it, bedtime. Izuku barely acknowledged him, eyes struggling to stay open. He did, however, definitely notice when Bakugo gently grabbed his shoulders and laid him down on the bed. Shocked, he didn't even struggle as he was laid on his back, Todoroki moving with him until he was nestled against Izuku's side. What? Shut up, Deku, and move over, Bakugo grumbled, pulling the blankets up to cover them both and slipping beneath them himself, the soft flannel of his pajama pants brushing against Izuku's leg. Izuku let out several incoherent noises as both Bakugo and Todoroki settled their heads on his chest, using him as a pillow. Kacchan, Todoroki, are you going to sleep in my bed? With me? Obviously, Bakugo scoffed, throwing a possessive arm over Izuku's waist. Todoroki grunted softly as Bakugo's hand smacked into his side, but didn't complain, eyes already closed. Now be quiet, I'm tired. Your heartbeat sounds nice, Todoroki mumbled, and Izuku found that hard to believe when it was racing like an overworked horse. Todoroki's contented exhale was barely impeded by Izuku's thin t-shirt to warm his skin. Dude, we brought your futon, Kaminari said, a little nervous now. Izuku sent him a pleading look, but the blonde looked at a loss. Shut it, Pikachu. If you bother me again, I will kick you out. Wow, this is so wild, Kirishima whispered, but quieted as Bakugo made a violent gesture in his direction. Izuku fretted, still not quite certain how things ended up this way. Calm down, Deku, we're not going to do anything you don't want, Bakugo muttered. Sleep. Single quote. Izuku said, struggling to keep his eyes open. He didn't know if that was really true, but in the last few hours, other than cuddling him they hadn't done anything too untoward. Besides, Izuku had run out of energy to worry about it anymore. With all the excitement, he thought he'd have passed out hours ago, yet here he was in the wee hours of the morning, overwarm, embarrassed beyond belief and suffocating beneath more affection than he'd received in his entire life. Whatever else came, he could deal with it in the morning. A morning that came much too soon. In the back of Izuku's exhausted mind, he knew he was awake, but couldn't open his eyes, not yet. Not while the horrors of the last few days still played on repeat in his mind over and over again, weighed him down so thoroughly that he felt physically heavy with it, like he couldn't actually move. Wait, MNH. Izuku pried his heavy lids open and blinked slowly, once, twice, 3 times. But no matter how many times he blinked, the scene in front of him did not change. Todoroki lay against Izuku's side, face relaxed with sleep, mouth parted gently and hair draped over his high cheekbones like the most luxurious of silks. He seemed so much more expressive in his sleep, as if the pressures of the waking world couldn't reach him here, a small smile playing at the corner of his parted lips in reaction to some pleasant dream. The sun glinted off his unfairly smooth, unfreckled skin and Izuku felt pretty pessimistic at that moment, because how was it fair that someone could look so perfect? As if his thoughts had been projected aloud, Todoroki's dual-toned lashes fluttered open, his heterochromatic eyes focusing on Izuku's face. Instantly they lit up, softened, and he smiled this smile that had Izuku's heart racing and his head fighting to catch up, because... Chi-chi Todoroki, Izuku yelped, jerking backward, face flushing quickly enough to make him dizzy. WH, what are you doing here? He didn't get too far, Todoroki's arms around him instinctively holding him tighter. The other boy yawned widely, nose wrinkling like a disgruntled kitten, and it had to be one of the most adorable things Izuku had ever seen. But that was totally beside the point, because what was he doing in Izuku's bed? Hua! Someone groaned from behind and Izuku jumped at the sound of Kirishima's muffled voice. He gasped, oh, right, the love quirk, that meant. 'Bout time you woke up, lazy assholes. Izuku whipped his head around and gaped at the sight of Bakugo striding back into the room from the hall, shirtless and damp. Bakugo had a towel around his neck, wet hair plastered to his forehead and pajama pants holding onto his slim hips with a prayer. Clearly he'd just gotten back from the showers. Izuku blushed, averting his eyes sharply. Even though he'd seen Bakugo shirtless countless times before in locker rooms and the like, the context of this situation was completely different. Don't look away, Bakugo said, and Izuku flinched as the words were spoken right into his flushed ear, the other boy having closed the distance between them in a heartbeat. The inner shrieking from the day before came back full force and he could only hide his burning face into Todoroki's chest. Which in hindsight, wasn't helping matters. Ew, it's too damn early in the morning for this, Kaminari groaned from somewhere to Izuku's left, only to yelp as a foot landed in his gut, silencing him. It's 10 in the morning, Banana Republic, Bakugo grumbled. How long are you losers going to sleep anyway? Oh, Izuku said with a nervous laugh, pushing himself up from Todoroki's embrace. Todoroki blinked at him muzzily before yawning again. Izuku looked away. Guess I was tired. Yeah, well, Bakugo said gruffly. You probably needed it then. Wait, was Bakugo being nice to him? Izuku blinked and turned around, but Bakugo was already facing the other way, kicking Kirishima awake. Oi, get up, shitty hair. Deku needs to get ready and US are in the way. Nah, Bakubro, why are you so mean? Kirishima whined in a decidedly not manly way. ... Right, love quirk. Izuku watched numbly as Bakugo shepherded the 2 sleepy extras from the room, muttering all the while. When the volatile blonde turned back to face him, Izuku examined him carefully, looking into his eyes for any sign of the almost punch-drunk quality of his gaze the day previous. To his relief, there wasn't, just Bakugo's usual scowl, even if it was a bit softened at the moment. It took Izuku several long seconds to realize that Bakugo was staring at him just as intently. What is it? Bakugo's eyes narrowed. You, grew WWWWL. Bakugo's brows climbed up his forehead as Izuku's face exploded with color. It's like a little monster, Todoroki said frankly, poking Izuku in his rumbling stomach. Izuku yelped, tickled, and a small smile quirked Todoroki's lips. His sleepiness was swiftly wearing off, it seemed, eyes sharpening to their usual watchful stare. With a hum, Todoroki lifted himself into a sitting position. We should get you some food. Oh, that won't be necessary, really, Izuku stammered, but Bakugo scoffed and reached toward Izuku's face. Izuku's eyes went wide and he flinched away, but Bakugo only ruffled his hair lightly before turning toward the door. "Get ready, I'll go make some breakfast." With his face flushed, Izuku watched Bakugo leave, not even slamming the door behind him. Maybe the love quirk was a little less intense today. Yesterday the two of them couldn't keep their hands off Izuku, but now, other than being really nice, they weren't doing anything that made him uncomfortable. Todoroki mused, placing a hand on his chin and looking as though he was thinking hard. "Maybe I don't have to take a shower. I don't want to leave you. Please take a shower," Izuku groaned, covering his face with both hands. Okay, maybe it hadn't after all. Todoroki was silent for a moment, and Izuku peeked between his fingers to see what the holdup was. Todoroki looked at him consideringly, leaning in a little closer. "Would that make you happy?" Izuku felt the flush all the way from his toes to the tips of his disheveled hair. "Why yes, it would make me very, very happy if you left to take a shower, right now." He didn't know how much more of this he could take. Todoroki stared at him for a couple more seconds before nodding resolutely to himself. "Okay, but I won't be long. I know you don't really want to be alone right now." He slipped past the flabbergasted Izuku and walked lightly to the door without a backward glance, leaving Izuku finally, blessedly alone. Izuku let his hands fall slowly to the bedcovers, staring at the door Todoroki had just vacated, face finally feeling like it was going back to normal as he puzzled out the other boy's words. What did he mean by that? Facing his classmates was just as bad as Izuku imagined. No, scratch that, it was 100 times worse. By the time Izuku brought himself to go down to the common area, he really was hungry. Pandemonium was already in full swing, complete with shrieking, hysterical laughter and the growling of an enraged bear. He sighed, already resigning himself to another exhausting day, although this one would be trying for completely different reasons. Descending the final few stairs as if he were about to meet his maker and not a bunch of overzealous high schoolers, Izuku cautiously peeked around the corner. Bakugo he found first because of course he did. The blonde boy was in full-out fight mode in the kitchen, a group of 1A's more excitable students buzzing around with expressions ranging from amusement to outright horror. Despite screaming expletives every few moments, Bakugo was making food as he'd promised, much to Izuku's surprise. And then he was like, "Hey, half and half, touch him here," Kaminari said in his best Bakugo impression, which was to say, not a very good one at all. His face looked more constipated than angry and his voice wasn't nearly deep enough to pull off the blonde's spectacular growl. But that was beside the point. What were they talking about over there? Izuku's face went 6 shades of crimson as the class laughed uproariously among exclamations of surprise, and Izuku knew at that moment that telling Kaminari of all people anything was a huge mistake. "I swear to, asshole, I'll murder you," Bakugo snarled, aggressively stirring batter in a bowl, somehow managing not to get pancake mix everywhere. White powder covered his hands and front as if he'd met a bag of flour in a back alley. "Oh, but you can't," Kaminari sing-songed, "because you have to make breakfast for your precious Midorya." Dude, maybe you should tone it down a little," Kirishima said with a placating gesture, ever the peacekeeper. Yet his face also twitched with amusement for all he tried to hide it. "Are you kidding me?" Mina shouted at the top of her lungs, a grin so wide on her face that she might end up straining it. "This is pure gold. OMG, OMG, I knew there was something going on between the three of them," Hagakure gushed, and Izuku could practically hear the blush rising on her transparent face. "But isn't it because of the love quirk, Toru-chan? We shouldn't jump to conclusions, Hiro." "What, you can't tell me that's all it is?" Mina whined. "They've all been wrapped up in each other since the sports festival, we all saw it." "No, I refuse to believe it," Uraraka shouted, and Izuku startled, not having noticed her behind everyone else. "There's no way that Bakugo would ever love Deku, he's so mean to him all the time." Ouch, that one stung a little. But she wasn't wrong. Bakugo froze and turned slowly before jabbing a spoon threateningly in Uraraka's direction. A bit of batter flicked off and splattered against the floor. "Oi, you don't get to decide who I love, round cheeks. And I'm the only one who can call him that, so shut the up." Izuku's eyes widened. Did Bakugo just tell everyone that he loved? Wait, forget that, he had to say that under the quirk's influence. But, did Bakugo just acknowledge that he didn't use Deku as an insult anymore? Was that for real, or was that also an effect of the quirk? The kitchen went silent for several seconds in the wake of Bakugo's confession before once again exploding in mayhem. Deciding that it wouldn't actually be a good idea to hide in his room for the rest of the day, Izuku steeled himself and walked into the kitchen, drawing everyone's attention. All eyes turned on him like a pack of wolves to their very timid prey. Morning everyone, he said with a strained smile. Instantly he found himself surrounded by the girls of the class, most vehemently Uraraka, Hagakure, and Mina, babbling questions and generally being noisy. Izuku said, lifting his hands in surrender, head spinning. Yes, it's true. Kacchan and Todoroki got hit with a love quirk and for some weird reason, they latched onto me. Aizawa-sensei said it would only last for a week, so. Unfortunately, the din only got louder when Bakugo was set off once again by something the boys were saying to him over the counter. Izuku bit his lip, the low-grade headache from yesterday coming back full force with a heavy throb in his temple. He closed his eyes, ears ringing with all the loud voices. God, he really just wanted everyone to be quiet. An arm wrapped around Izuku from behind, pulling him into a sturdy chest while another covered his eyes with a cool, soothing palm, drawing him away from the girls. Izuku tensed, but the room fell silent as Izuku's eyesight was blocked and instantly his headache felt better. He relaxed with a relieved sigh, a little stunned but not enough to pull away from the soothing touch. I would appreciate it if everyone stopped shouting. Midorya has a headache, Todoroki said quietly beside Izuku's ear, his chin hooked over his shoulder. Izuku's heart rate picked up just the slightest bit. Someone across the room snorted but yelped a second later. That's enough, man, Kirishima scolded. Todoroki, Izuku said, gently pulling the palm from his eyes to meet the stunned gazes of everyone else in the room. So it's true, Uraraka said faintly, cheeks pink. She looked a little sad and Izuku frowned in concern. Before he could ask, though, he was interrupted by Mina and Hagakure's squeals of delight. He winced. Todoroki must have made a face because both girls quieted a second later with mumbled apologies. Mina looked far from put out, however. So, does this mean these two suddenly want to bone Midoriya-chan? She said with stars in her eyes. Mina, Uraraka complained. Mina, this isn't one of those cheesy shonen mangas where the protagonist falls in love with the one who harassed them. Real life doesn't work that way, Hiro, Tsuyu said reasonably. Dark circumstances, Tokiyami said from somewhere in the back to several hums of agreement. This is absolutely unacceptable, Iida finally piped in. He'd been quiet up to this point, but it seemed that he could no longer hold back his thoughts on the matter. He strode to the front of the group and gestured sharply at Todoroki. I demand that the three of you maintain a proper 3-foot distance. Todoroki, remove your hands from Midoriya at once. But I don't want to, Todoroki said with all seriousness, squeezing Izuku a little tighter as if he might try to get away. Izuku huffed, but despite the severe awkwardness of the situation, he found that he didn't really mind the hug. It was actually kind of nice, especially since Todoroki was cooling his neck again, a boon for the tension that had been plaguing him for months. Regardless, it's inappropriate, Iida insisted. Besides, did you even ask Midoriya if it was okay to touch him so much? Izuku felt Todoroki tense slightly against his back. It's okay, Iida, they can't help it. That doesn't mean it's okay, Iida said seriously, brows drawn together. Okay, well, he had a bit of a point. Midoriya wants us to touch him. Izuku's eyes widened, face freezing. WH. How do you know that? Iida demanded, ignoring Izuku's mortified stuttering. Todoroki looked stumped for a couple of seconds. I can feel it. Iida's eyes widened in genuine anger this time. Just saying you can feel, it is not explicit consent. Now let Midoriya go and leave him be. He reached for Todoroki's arm and inwardly Izuku was panicking. wide eyes tracking the movement as if he was seeing it in slow motion. He got that Iida was just trying to look out for him. He was just trying to be a good friend. Izuku knew that. And yes, Iida was absolutely correct that neither Todoroki nor Bakugo had listened when Izuku told them to leave him alone, but everything they'd been doing, every touch, word and gentle look, it was. He just wished that everyone would just back up and let him think. Iida's hand was smacked out of the air violently, the sound of skin meeting skin deafening in the silence that followed. A cloud of white flour drifted through the air in front of Izuku's face as a pair of black-clad shoulders blocked Todoroki and Izuku from a shell-shocked Iida. Izuku couldn't see Bakugo's expression, but his voice was the kind of deathly quiet it only got when he was truly pissed. It sent a shiver up and down Izuku's spine, and he wasn't entirely sure it was out of fear. Back off. Iida reared back as if he'd been punched. He rallied quickly enough though, pushing his glasses up his nose and rising to his considerable height. Even then, he couldn't match Bakugo in sheer presence. He opened his mouth to retaliate, but Bakugo never gave him the chance. "The do you think we're doing here, huh? You think we're going to rape him? Huh?" Iida looked just as shocked as Izuku felt. "Okay," Shiro said loudly, startling everyone out of their stunned silence. "That's enough, I think. Everyone, let's let them sort this out in privacy, yeah." "Ah," Mina complained, but already the more reasonable members of the class were shepherding the busybodies from the kitchen. "But I want to see what happens next." "This is none of our business," Momo said sternly, grabbing Mina and Kaminari by the arms and dragging them out the door. Soon enough, the rest of the class except for Iida, Kirishima, Uraraka and the three catalysts remained. Izuku felt himself ease ever so slightly now that the peanut gallery had left, but the tension of Bakugo's final accusation hung between them all. The door clicked shut, throwing them all into a heavy silence. Bakugo scowled as if to say, "Well, of course not," Iida said after a short hesitation, his severe expression falling a bit. "But the fact remains that both you and Todoroki are under the influence of an unknown quirk that is compelling you to." "I am not being controlled by some damn quirk," Bakugo snapped, striking his hand through the air. "You think I would be doing any of this if I didn't want to be?" "Me, quote. Yeah, but dude," Kirishima said gently, laying a hand on Bakugo's shoulder. Bakugo didn't brush him off, but he didn't ease his fierce glare either. "Think about it. This isn't like you. You don't just declare your feelings like this. And Todoroki doesn't hug people. Something is clearly up." Bakugo blinked, frowning as his eyes went a little unfocused. "That doesn't mean I never wanted to," Todoroki finally spoke, bringing attention to himself. Izuku wanted to look him in the face, but Todoroki's grip made that impossible. Instead, he had to settle with listening intently to the serious tone of his voice. "I'm not sure what exactly that quirk did to us, but I wanted to hug Midorya before, and now I can." He pressed Izuku closer, and Izuku's breath hitched. "Loving him feels so good." Quote. What he said, Bakugo finally muttered. "We're not going to do something Deku doesn't want, for s sake." Izuku reeled. That couldn't be true. Did they want to be with him like this before the quirk? No, that was impossible. That was just the quirk making them remember things that were never there. Iida seemed to agree. "Your words are reassuring. However, the fact remains that we do not know the extent of what this quirk may compel you to do, and I'm not entirely comfortable leaving Midorya in your hands." Bakugo's eyes narrowed. "Listen, you." "I believe them," Izuku cut in, silencing them both. Bakugo shot him a look, and it might have been his imagination, but Izuku thought he might have surprised him a little. Neither Todoroki or Kacchan have done anything I don't want. I think, rather than making them lust after me or something, the quirk is making them do whatever makes me happy." "Oh," Kirishima said, "so when Todoroki said he could feel it, it meant he was in tune with Midorya's needs or something." Iida still looked skeptical. "Midorya, you actually want them hanging all over you like this?" Not exactly," Izuku said with a shrug. "I think. Well, I've always admired Kacchan. Having him be nice to me is kind of like a dream." And Todoroki is so reliable and always made me feel safe. And he couldn't look up from the floor. God, this was so embarrassing. Everything's been so intense lately and it feels like all I ever do is train or fight. Being touched like this feels nice. He bit his lip and fell silent, face burning hotly. It was the truth, after all. Well, mostly. But the rest didn't matter. It never would. That makes sense, Uraraka finally said. Her hand was placed over her heart and her eyes were also turned down. But still, her expression was fierce. I've felt the same, ever since the mission ever since the USJ. Uraraka, Iida said, shocked. No, I know we signed up to be heroes, and that it's a super dangerous occupation, but sometimes it's good to remember that we're people too. Sometimes we just want to be held. Silence met her words, and then Uraraka seemed to realize what she said. Her face went crimson. I mean. She covered her face with both hands, groaning with embarrassment. Ah ha ha. Hiroshima laughed awkwardly, trying to break the intensity of the moment. He smacked Bakugo on the back. That might be true, but not this prickly guy, am I right? My man Bakugo doesn't want all that mushy crap. That's not true, Bakugo said, smacking Kirishima's hand away and completely ignoring the gobsmacked expression on the redhead's face. I can be mushy. Tell them, icy hot. It's true, Todoroki said mildly. He's actually super sweet when we sleep together. Like a totally different guy. Izuku was positive he could have heard a pen drop off of All Might's desk halfway across the campus. The door burst open and the entirety of the rest of Class 1A fell into a heap on the kitchen floor. Mina, on top of the pile, leveraged herself up and let out an unholy screech, stars in her eyes. Fought. Izuku slumped back into Todoroki's willing hold as he was deafened by the ensuing chaos. He groaned. Why him? Chapter text. Izuku ate his breakfast in a daze, idly cutting his pancakes into uneven quarters one by one. Shortly after Todoroki's shocking announcement, Bakugo had demanded they leave the common area, Todoroki and Izuku retreating back to Izuku's room. Bakugo finished making them food while fending off the invasive questions of their shocked classmates alone. Izuku hadn't noticed when Todoroki had led him from the common area to sit him down in front of his coffee table, nor when Bakugo returned and placed a plate in front of him. He'd been simply unable to process the news he'd just been hit with, the news that no one had even an inkling of before it dropped into their midst like an atom bomb. All right, hear him out. It made no sense. It was even more far-fetched than the thought that Todoroki and Kacchan were attracted to him. No matter how many times Izuku turned what he knew about the two of them over in his mind, he couldn't make heads or tails of it. Bakugo dating Todoroki and being sweet to him, when he'd never, not once, indicated that he even tolerated the other boy in public. Todoroki being okay with Bakugo's tantrums and overbearing personality, so similar to that of his father's that Izuku would have thought he'd loathe him. Just, where did it come from? Why? It was beyond Izuku's comprehension. Izuku tilted his head, eyes distant as his laden fork missed his mouth once, twice, then paused to rest against his cheek as he considered. Okay, maybe he was just oblivious. Izuku could admit to himself that he could sometimes be dense about these things. After all, what did he know about dating? No one had ever given him the time of day. Maybe he should start by outlining what they had in common, then go from there. It was true that they were both attractive and powerful, so there was that. They both wanted to be the number one hero, even if their reasons for it were intrinsically different. They both. Now that he thought about it, they were fierce rivals, although Izuku thought that it had been one-sided on Bagu's part. He remembered during the school festival, unfortunately secondhand, though Izuku would have adored watching the fight, that Bakugo practically begged Todoroki to face him for real, had been insanely jealous that he'd used his fire for Izuku and no one else. Wait, he might be onto something. Izuku latched onto the thought, placing a hand over his mouth and completely ignoring the sticky mess on his cheek as his fork clattered to the plate unheeded. A low growling started in the background, but Izuku was following too important a thread of thought to notice. Bakugo had been jealous. Maybe that was the start. Bakugo hated it when the people around him held back and lost it if he thought he wasn't being taken seriously. Maybe he'd spent so much time trying to get Todoroki to consider him strong that it turned into something more. But what about Todoroki, then? Izuku had a hard time imagining that the soft-spoken, thoughtful boy would overlook Bakugo's rather intense personality. As far as he could remember, Todoroki did his best to ignore Bakugo at the best of times, and as much as Izuku hated to admit it, he couldn't blame him. If what Todoroki told him was true, and Izuku's instincts about endeavor were accurate, then Bakugo was uncomfortably like his father. Except Bakugo acknowledged when someone was strong. In his own way, sure, but he still did. Perhaps Todoroki found that attractive, as he secretly wanted acknowledgement from his father. Izuku, more than anyone else, understood what an incredible rush it was to gain Bakugo's respect. Also, what was that saying about ending up dating your parents? Did Izuku get that right, or was he just making things up? Izuku chewed slowly, stirring his fork across his plate aimlessly and not even tasting his food. It was entirely possible that he was overthinking this. Midorya, that's not, you'll make yourself sick. The growling got louder and the table started to vibrate. It almost pulled him out of his thoughts when Izuku was struck with an idea. What if he was overthinking this and it was as simple as physical attraction? That was the first thing that came to mind after all. A slight flush rose in Izuku's cheeks as he groped for a drink to wash down this rather chewy meal. He was finding it hard to swallow, but that might just be the fact that it was really inappropriate to think about the two of them together like that while was eating. Deku, will you shut the up and eat your food already? Bakugo shouted right in his ear before slamming his hand down with more force than strictly necessary. Izuku shrieked, brought out of his musings violently as his plate nearly upended into his lap. Immediately he paled and started hacking, sputtering to try and get the awful taste out of his mouth. What had he been eating? He didn't realize that Bakugo's cooking would be so bad. What the say that to my face, bastard? My cooking is the best, you're just too much of a freak to eat it properly. Bakugo snarled before snatching the fork from Izuku's hand as if Izuku couldn't be trusted not to hurt himself with it. On Izuku's other side, Todoroki patted Izuku's coughing frame on his shoulder, gently pulling the half-eaten napkin from his hands. With syrup running down Izuku's cheek, he stared down at the disaster zone that was his plate, a little shocked that he'd made such a mess. Give me that, Bakugo said shortly, removing Izuku's plate to attempt to rescue his tortured breakfast. Here, Todoroki said lightly, pulling Izuku's face around by the chin and dabbing at the mess on his cheeks with a damp, unmolested napkin. Thanks, Izuku said dazedly, still distracted. His head spun. He felt a bit like a chick being cared for by two particularly motherly hens, and he honestly had no idea what to do with all of this affection. Geez, you really are out of it, Bakugo sighed, waiting impatiently for Todoroki to finish his ministrations. You know, if you would actually eat something instead of muttering so damn much, you might feel better. He had a point, but Izuku rarely felt hungry these days, so he was finding it hard to make it a priority, especially when his whole world had been turned sideways. He turned to Bakugo to tell him just that when he paused in shock. Bakugo was staring at him with an irritated scowl, which wasn't unusual in itself. He always looked at Izuku like that. But what was a little bit strange, and heck, maybe Izuku was overreacting, but he just couldn't process what was right in front of him was the fork that he held in front of Izuku's mouth as if he expected Izuku to eat off it. What? He said dumbly, not quite comprehending what Bakugo wanted. Bakugo's brows drew downward, scowl becoming fiercer. You just said that my cooking was shit and you haven't even tasted it. What? You'd rather eat your goddamn napkin than eat something I made. Quote. Izuku thought he was rather missing the point. And no. That's not. MF. Bakugo didn't seem to care what he had to say because he shoved the food into Izuku's mouth the second he opened it to reply. Flavor exploded across Izuku's tongue and his eyes widened at the burst of sugar, mouth salivating at once. He'd been wrong. Bakugo's cooking was delicious. Izuku mumbled with a full mouth, expression melting into a delighted smile. Of course it is, that's what I said, isn't it? Bakugo snapped, though the wrinkle between his eyes had lessened quite a bit with Izuku's admission. He scooped up another furkful and offered it to Izuku, and this time the younger didn't hesitate to snap it up, humming with contentment and licking his lips. It was only when he opened his eyes that he caught Bakugo's expression. He froze, eyes flickering from Bakugo's smug smirk to his intense gaze, and realized belatedly what he was actually doing. Izuku's heart sped up, but he couldn't bring himself to lean back, suddenly fiercely glad that they'd relocated to somewhere a bit more private, because he wasn't sure if he could handle an audience on top of the mortification making its way swiftly up his neck. Bakugo didn't seem to share his trepidation, because he slowly lifted the fork back up to Izuku's mouth, waiting expectantly for him to take another bite. Too bad Izuku was too busy freaking out on the inside to take it. Todoroki stared at both of them, something like curiosity sparkling in his eyes. "It's just like TV," he said, breaking the tension between them like a bull in a china shop. Izuku went rigid. Todoroki took a bite of his own breakfast that was quite a bit less sugary than Izuku's, as if this were a commonplace event to watch two of his classmates who could barely have a civil conversation most days feed each other. Bakugo sighed, maybe realizing that Izuku wasn't about to take another bite, and lowered the fork. "What are you on about? You're feeding him like in the shows," Todoroki elaborated, staring at the fork in Bakugo's hand like it held a morsel of the most delicious veal rather than a rather messily cut glob of pancake. Bakugo glanced down at the fork with a lifted brow. "I guess." His eyes narrowed before he examined Todoroki's face closer. Todoroki was staring right back, leaning around a stunned Izuku with his head practically resting on the table. A slow smile grew on Bakugo's face, and Izuku nearly choked on the mouthful of food that he still hadn't managed to swallow, a cold trickle of sweat making its way down his neck. "Need something icy hot?" Todoroki hummed as if he was seriously considering the question. His gaze was drawn back to Bakugo's hand and then Izuku's mouth, lingering there for a good 20 seconds while Izuku tried and failed not to break out into goosebumps. He looked slowly back to Bakugo's hand before meeting his eyes, clearly coming to a decision. "Yeah, I want that." Bakugo's canines flashed as Todoroki opened his mouth expectantly, and Izuku felt a little dizzy as it became entirely too hot in here. "All you had to do was ask," Bakugo said imperiously, but with a distinct husk to his voice that hadn't been there before. He rested his cheek on his closed fist smugly as he held the fork that he'd been feeding Izuku with to Todoroki instead. Without hesitation, Todoroki leaned across Izuku's lap and took it into his mouth, teeth scraping over the tines of the fork obscenely loud in the quiet room. Izuku was fairly certain he felt the sound like fingernails dragging down the back of his neck. With a completely straight face, Todoroki chewed, throat working as he swallowed it down, and he had to be doing this on purpose. "It's too sweet," he complained, wrinkling his nose, and Bakugo snorted in amusement, rolling his eyes good-naturedly, which sent Izuku for an entirely different loop. "That's because I didn't make it for you, candy cane." They were flirting. Oh God, they were flirting while practically sandwiching Izuku between them. Finally swallowing his mouthful in one painfully large gulp, Izuku realized between gasping breaths that he may need to reevaluate once again, because that was way too familiar and natural to be new. What the heck? Had he really been so out of it the past couple months that he didn't see this coming? It was true that he had been distracted with work study, and Todoroki and Bakugo had been doing the remedial course together. He hadn't exactly seen them outside of class for any length of time in a while, but were they always like this? Had Izuku been so obtusely unobservant that he completely missed two of his classmates falling for each other? "Oi, don't get distracted again, damn it," Bakugo snapped, pinching Izuku's chin between harsh fingers and making him look him in the eye. "You need to eat." Shaking off the grip with a disgruntled pwa, Izuku weathered a spike of irritation and hurt with a wide-eyed glare. "How the heck do you expect me to eat when I find out that two of my friends are dating and I never noticed, Kacchan?" Why hadn't they told him? They were friends, right? Kind of. At least, he thought so. He looked pointedly at Todoroki but paused when the boy looked just as stunned as Izuku felt. "We're dating." Todoroki asked slowly, looking at Bakugo as if he'd never quite seen him properly before. Quote, quote. The clatter of the fork hitting the table startled Izuku so badly that when he caught sight of Bakugo's face he nearly cut his losses and bolted for the door. Bakugo didn't react for an unsettlingly long time, expression completely blank and lips slightly parted as if he'd taken a blow to the face. Was I wrong? Izuku said nervously, wringing his hands. You said that you sleep together, so I thought they were dating, right? Bakugo just spoon-fed Todoroki, for goodness sake. Izuku might have been dense about these things, but that was kind of hard to misinterpret. When Bakugo failed to respond, Todoroki answered instead. Quote, We do sleep together, sometimes. But we haven't been on any dates. Todoroki's brows were drawn together in confusion, looking to Bakugo like he was a complete mystery for all that they must know each other intimately. Bakugo, for his part, looked like he was struggling internally, eyes blank and distant as if he couldn't decide which emotion he felt the strongest. Izuku could practically see the fuse shortening on top of his head, though, and dreaded when it finally ran out. Todoroki, maybe we should, Izuku stuttered, slowly getting up from his seat and backing away, pulling at Todoroki's shoulder urgently. Todoroki didn't seem to feel it, didn't take his attention from Bakugo. Finally, Bakugo seemed to come to a decision. Gaze narrowing, he grabbed Todoroki's wrist. Get up. Hauling Todoroki to his feet, he backed him up until the fairer boy's back hit the wall with a dull thud. Izuku's heart was pounding so quickly that he was afraid it would jump right out of his chest. Oh God, they were going to fight, he really shouldn't have said anything. Kacchan, please don't. Bakugo paused, looking at Izuku for a few seconds, scanning him from his frightened face to his hand extended in entreaty. His eyes seemed to lose focus for a second, the tension between his brows easing ever so slightly, but a moment later he shook it off, turning back to Todoroki who still looked confused. Tell me something, Bakugo said lowly, crowding into Todoroki's space. Do you think I'm the kind of man who would sleep with just anyone? Todoroki blinked, gaping. Quote, I don't know, he said honestly. I thought you only slept with me because I was stronger than you. Who's stronger? Bakugo's fist slammed into the wall beside Todoroki's head and Izuku lurched forward to intervene before things came to blows. But Bakugo shot him a glare, freezing him in his tracks. Stay out of this, Deku, he snapped before giving Todoroki all of his attention. Yet still, to Izuku's relief, his hand relaxed from its intimidating grip to rest flat against the dented drywall. Izuku stepped back to watch carefully, ready to jump in at a moment's notice. Todoroki looked between Bakugo's crimson eyes rapidly, a small frown pulling at his face. Your power makes you a challenge, but don't think for a second I couldn't win a fight against you, half bastard. Todoroki looked, if possible, even more confused. So, I'm a challenge. Bakugo inhaled sharply, mouth opening and closing several times as he seemed to struggle with himself. No, he clenched his jaw, cutting off his words forcefully. Izuku had his hands over his mouth so that he could hold back the gasp clawing at his throat. That couldn't be all. Was Bakugo just going to let Todoroki think that that was all he was to him? He felt his heart twinge in sympathy, a small whimper making it through his clenched fingers at the lost look on Todoroki's face. God, you may be a good fighter, but you're an idiot. Did it ever occur to you that I might actually be attracted to you? Bakugo shouted as if the words were physically torn from him. He jerked his head to the side, making a slight wheezing sound as tremors started from somewhere between his tensed shoulder blades to radiate out to all four limbs. He looked like he was in pain, yet Todoroki couldn't seem to speak, staring blankly at the boy pinning him to the wall. Izuku felt his dread grow, another whimper making its way out, but this time it was Todoroki's inactivity that gave him anxiety. Izuku's eyes filled with tears. He'd never seen Kacchan so vulnerable like this and he decided then and there that he hated it. Todoroki, do something, please. It was then that Todoroki moved, placing a hand on Bakugo's shoulder. Bakugo's head jerked up in surprise, but Todoroki looked just as bewildered by his actions. I respect you, he said haltingly. His brow furrowed and Izuku felt his stomach drop with disappointment. I consider you a friend. He was starting to look distressed now, and at this point, Izuku was holding his breath. I like it when you touch me, Todoroki blurted, eyes wide and lips trembling. He looked on the verge of tears, and Bakugo's shaking was only getting worse, and Izuku just couldn't take the tension any longer. Stop! Bakugo nearly screamed, ripping himself away from Todoroki and pressing his forehead against the opposite wall. His shoulders heaved with some strong emotion, and Todoroki's expression remained frozen as he fell slowly to his knees, looking all the world like he'd just been told someone he loved had died. Izuku reared back, a sharp sting in his chest surprising him with its strength, obliterating every thought as he struggled and failed to understand what just happened. Concern gripped him as he couldn't decide which boy he worried about more. Had this been his fault? He really shouldn't have brought this up if this was going to be the result. He'd just been curious and maybe just a tiny bit hurt. Even so, this reaction was extreme. All he really wanted was for them to tell each other honestly how they feel. I don't know, Todoroki said brokenly as he buried his face into both hands, fingers pulling at his bangs in frustration. Bakugo said, choking on his words as if he tried to physically gnaw them back. Stop! Izuku panicked, wavering back and forth, though he had absolutely no idea what was going on or how to help. Stop what? He cried, only for it to hit him like a bullet train. It was him. It was Izuku that was causing this. The quirk. It was making them do what Izuku wanted. He paled, thinking over the last few minutes in a new, dark light. He'd asked if they were dating, but they clearly hadn't talked about it. Izuku wanted them to get along, so they didn't fight. He wanted clarification on their feelings, so they. Izuku looked at Todoroki, who hid behind his hands in distress because he hadn't given Izuku the answer he wanted to hear. Then Bakugo, who would never willingly talk about his feelings, much less before he even accepted them himself. Yet Izuku had selfishly forced his will over them, making them take a step they clearly weren't ready for. In other words, he destroyed the organic growth of their relationship, maybe ruined it forever. Oh no, Izuku said with a quiet gasp. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to force you to say things you didn't mean. The two of them looked up from their positions on the floor, staring with hazed eyes as Izuku's own filled with tears. He hadn't intended this at all. I forgot, I shouldn't have cried. He'd had no idea the quirk was this strong. When I heard you were together, I had imposed his own romantic ideals onto them instead of letting them get there on their own, because he choked. Because he'd been the little, tiniest bit happy to learn they didn't hate each other. They were two of the people that he admired most, that he wanted to get closer to, and it had always made him sad to see them so at odds. Was Izuku's desire the only reason the two of them were able to get along now? Even if they had slept together in the past, maybe it was just physical release for them, a way to get rid of the tension between them other than with violence. And the quirk made them not only bound to Izuku's will but forced to be together in a way they possibly didn't want to be. Izuku flinched as two sets of hands sank into his hair, wrapped around him and gentled his face. His eyes sprung open to find Bakugo and Todoroki surrounding him with concern in their eyes. Shish, it's all right, it's not your fault, Todoroki said tremulously, running his fingers through Izuku's hair. Bakugo was decidedly less gentle as he rubbed over his back and shoulders vigorously. Stop thinking stupid shit, he muttered. You look awful when you cry. Izuku stared at the two of them blankly, hating himself even as their touch calmed him down and eased the stinging in his chest. They were comforting him. He didn't deserve that, not after what he'd done to them. I said, cut it out, Bakugo chided with a roll of his eyes. Look, we're fine. Grabbing the front of Todoroki's shirt, the blonde coaxed him forward. After a slight pause, Todoroki gave in, meeting Bakugo halfway in a shy beep. He hummed, closing his eyes in contentment as Bakugo watched him through a half-lidded gaze. Despite the flush heating his ears, Izuku found himself relaxing at the easy gesture between them, giving him hope that maybe he hadn't screwed things up after all. It did make him feel a little bit lonely though, to see them close like that. As if they'd read his mind, Todoroki and Bakugo pulled apart slightly with an obscene sound, pausing as they looked at Izuku beneath lowered lashes. Todoroki had a light dusting of red on his cheeks, lips damp where Bakugo had claimed them, and Izuku's stomach swooped low and dizzying as, without an ounce shame, Todoroki licked the moisture away with a small hum. Bakugo didn't take his burning eyes from Izuku as he slipped calloused fingers down Todoroki's jaw, unbelievably gently in a way Izuku had never known Bakugo was capable. "Isn't he pretty, Zuku?" Bakugo said with a smirk in his inflection, and Izuku made a startled sound in the back of his throat that couldn't have come from him, because it was too high-pitched, too needy, and he'd never shaped his voice in quite that way before. But he was too shocked to care, because for the first time in a near decade, Bakugo had used his name. It sent heat racing down his spine to thrash wildly somewhere behind his navel. His lungs restricted harshly, made it hard to breathe as Todoroki's brows rose up his forehead and Bakugo grinned predatorily. Izuku's skin suddenly felt too tight on his body, eyes dancing between the two of them as a rush of shame, want, made his every nerve ending prickle like the lightning of one for all over his skin. Kacchan, I said, Bakugo said slowly, deliberately. Don't you think he's pretty? Izuku blinked rapidly and couldn't help his gaze pulling back to Todoroki's serene face and realized abruptly how close the two of them were still, within arm's length, close enough to touch. Todoroki's fingers against his cheek had Izuku's spine locking up, shock immobilizing him as the boy drew closer, because there was nothing innocent or comforting about it this time. It was purely with desire that Todoroki looked at him now, moving slowly as if not to frighten a startled animal, which Izuku was starting to feel like, he thought hysterically, and sidled forward until he was hovering over Izuku and staring down into his eyes, knees on either side of Izuku's hips. He could feel his body heat, smell the peculiar wintry oak of Todoroki's scent envelop him as he sat immobile, and just when had he become so familiar with it? Overwhelmed, Izuku could barely react as Todoroki's breath ghosted over his face, sugary sweet with the morsel Bakugo had fed him. Todo, Izuku stuttered, hands hovering somewhere in the vicinity of Todoroki's slim hips. Shoto, Todoroki said softly, and Izuku's skin exploded with goosebumps as he nearly pressed the permission to use his given name against Izuku's lips. My name is Shoto. Izuku's brain ground to a halt. WHWH, a dark chuckle sounded in Izuku's ear, startlingly close enough that he could feel its warmth against the side of his neck. You heard him, Izuku. The man wants you to call his name. Bakugo husked, and Izuku couldn't help but flutter his eyes as his own name in that voice sent shivers down his spine. Maybe if you say it real nice he'll give you what you want. Izuku locked eyes with Todoroki, who was holding himself achingly still and close enough that if Izuku really wanted he could have stretched up and stolen the beat that was just within his reach. Todoroki's eyes were hazed, fever bright, and there was a slight tremor in the hands that rested lightly on Izuku's cheeks, one slick with warm sweat and the other just the slightest bit cold. He was looking at Izuku with something that Izuku had never seen before, could barely identify because no one had ever looked at him remotely like this, like Izuku had hung the moon and stars in the sky. It made him feel. It made him. Izuku's teeth and lips were forming around the word before he'd consciously thought of it, voice breathy and lower than he'd ever made it go before, something dark and covetous unfurling in his chest. Shoto. Todoroki's. No. Shoto's lips against his were so incredibly soft and unexpectedly warm that Izuku whimpered as they touched him, eyes fluttering closed as the other boy pressed the whole front of himself into Izuku with a relieved sigh, as if he'd finally achieved the prize he'd been after for an achingly long time. But no, it was Izuku that had been waiting for this for far too long, even if he hadn't truly realized it. Izuku, the one who felt like he was winning the most precious prize of all, as the boy he'd admired and respected from day one gave himself over eagerly to the press of their mouths. Izuku's hands dropped from their uncertain hover to clutch at Shoto's waist, squeezing perhaps a little too tightly with his overdeveloped grip. But his brain turned to mush when Shoto beeped and lowered himself down on Izuku's crossed legs so he could press closer, settling encouragingly into Izuku's hold. Izuku gasped with a swell of molten, unbearable heat when he realized in a startled rush that they were both, achingly hard. Shoto pressed into Izuku's abs, the whole, hot length of him moving against Izuku in tiny, agonizing circles, and Izuku clenched his eyes shut tightly, overwhelmed and shaking as Shoto pulled back slightly to lick at his slack lips, begging for entrance. Another dark, amused chuckle and hot breath over his skin had Izuku twitching, dragging Shoto down so that there wasn't a hair of space between them, shivering when Shoto ground down obligingly with a pleased little hitch of his breath. Bago grazed his sharp teeth over Izuku's collarbone and he whined. It was overwhelming. Too much, he wanted. Izuku wanted. Izuku's eyes snapped open, body going rigid as ice encased his insides, dousing his desire with cold, terrible dread. Todoroki pulled back immediately with a startled sound, face falling in dismayed confusion, but Izuku couldn't see him, blinded by a horrible realization. "Whoa, Deku," Bakugo said, jerking away from his side as Izuku's skin lit with green lightning. Todoroki scrambled off of him just in time for Izuku to lurch to his feet, backing away so quickly that slammed into the wall as far away from the two of them as he could get. His lamp jumped on his bedside table before clattering to the floor, a poster of All Might shaking loose from the wall to flutter onto the floor. Toshinori's grin gleamed accusingly at Izuku and he thought he was going to be ill. Izuku's breaths came quickly as he wrapped his hands tightly around his middle to try and rein in his nausea. What was he doing? He just discovered that Bakugo and Todoroki were bound to his desires and here Izuku was, taking advantage of them. It was sick, he was sick, how could he? He knew that they didn't really think of him that way, that they had to do what he wanted and still gave in to his desires like a creep. It took him several seconds to realize that neither Todoroki nor Bakugo had moved, both heroes staring at him silently, shell-shocked. It was entirely different from earlier when they'd comforted him and Izuku found himself terribly grateful because the last thing he wanted was for them to touch him when they didn't actually want to. As if he'd said his thoughts aloud, Bakugo's face crumpled with anger and Todoroki looked hurt, hair mussed and lips still damp, a small spark of fear in his eyes. Izuku flinched, realizing that they had next to zero control over their feelings and likely took his retreat as rejection. Suddenly Izuku was angry. With a strong surge of protective rage, Izuku determined that that was unacceptable, that he had no right to make them feel that way. This wasn't their fault, it was all Izuku's and that stupid quirks and he had to make this right. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Izuku looked at them with eyes overfull but grimace determined. "I'm sorry, I know that you can't help it and I shouldn't have taken advantage. It won't happen again." Bakugo's eyes widened with fury and Izuku couldn't stand to look at him anymore so he didn't, dropping his gaze to the floor. Izuku felt their eyes on him like ants on his skin and he ground his teeth harshly, willing himself not to break down. He felt dirty, like the worst kind of villain, the room too small, breath from his lungs too loud, and he couldn't stand it any longer. "Please," he whispered, knowing that what he was about to ask was incredibly selfish, but he didn't want them to see him like this, wanted time to think. "Please, just for a little while. I want to be alone." "What the?" Bakugo snarled, and Izuku flinched. "Don't lie to our faces, Deku. Please." Bakugo stared for several more seconds before growling in impotent rage. He spun on his heel and stalked from the room, slamming the door behind him so harshly that it bounced back open. Todoroki lingered for a moment longer with hurt and uncertainty hanging palpably in the air. Then he too left, quietly closing the door behind him so that it latched, the click echoing in Izuku's mind with mournful finality. Izuku took 3 stumbling steps to his bed and collapsed on it with a strangled sob, clutching his pillow to his chest as if its softness could soothe the sharp edges of his broken heart, but it couldn't because it still smelled like them, all 3 of their scents mingling together in a way he was certain their hearts never would. He pressed his face into it, wishing with a startling fierceness that this was real, and it shocked him to his core, tightened his throat until he choked on it. It wasn't fair. It was so cruel that he had to find out that he liked them so much more deeply than he'd ever imagined in this way, with some stupid quirk messing them up inside and putting false adoration into their eyes. It wasn't real, and that hurt more than Izuku could possibly describe. He couldn't stand Kacchan calling his name like that, couldn't stand the way Todoroki looked at him when it wasn't real. Another wave of guilt washed over Izuku as he remembered their faces when he'd pushed them away, branded into his mind because no matter what he was feeling right now, it had to be so much worse for them. Stop being so selfish, Izuku scolded himself. It wasn't their fault, and still, Izuku was being so self-centered. And Iida was concerned that they would take advantage of him when Izuku was the only one whose actions and feelings were his own. What kind of hero was he, feeling so sorry for himself when his two friends were obviously suffering? As his sobs quieted, he replayed the last few hours again and again in his head. Bakugo and Todoroki definitely had feelings for each other. If they had truly done exactly as Izuku desired, then they would have said that they loved each other and been done with it. But their confession sounded like the truth, and they'd managed to stop Izuku before he could force them to say something they didn't really mean. Izuku might have put a wrench in the natural development of their relationship, but maybe he could still fix this, help them realize. Still, how was Izuku going to do that without imposing his will? He needed to find out more. If earlier showed him anything, it was that they could resist his feelings at least a little, at least when it came to each other. He sat up slowly, wiping the lingering sensation of Todoroki's beep away as his thoughts raced, the beginnings of a plan forming in his mind. Something good would come out of this terrible situation if Izuku had anything to say about it. Izuku was going to protect them from himself, and maybe when all of this was over, when they realized how they'd been manipulated by the quirk, when they realized that they hated him, they would still have each other, and maybe, just maybe, with just a little nudge in the right direction, their relationship would be stronger than before. First things first, he needed to figure out how exactly the quirk worked so that he could be certain something like this didn't happen again. Then he would do his best to help. He owed them that, after all the trouble he'd put them through. Izuku couldn't see the expression on his face, the broken smile that trembled on his cheeks and the resignation in his eyes. Maybe if he could have, he would have realized that nothing was ever so straightforward, especially matters of the heart. Chapter text. Izuku scowled at the wrinkled paper beneath his irately tapping pen, though he had long hit a wall in his reasoning. He laid on his stomach, the floor cold against his skin, but ignored the discomfort in favor of his thoughts. Around him littered the remains of two separate notebooks, their pages marred by scribbled ink and rumpled beyond comprehension. It had been hours since he'd sent Todoroki and Bakugo away, yet he still hadn't made much headway in figuring out how the quirk works. With a sigh, Izuku dropped his pen and stared down at the information he had managed to gather. It was a simple recounting of that day and the previous day's events, but he'd been able to glean little insight into what it might mean. He'd racked his brain over and over trying to make sense of it. Love. Quirk log days 1 to 2. Initial observations. Both subjects display affection and desire towards me not previously recorded or observed. Both subjects seem less guarded than normal, revealing their relationship that had been hidden. A breakdown of barriers. Which ones? Why? Both subjects appear to be able to sense when I'm feeling strongly about something. They can't, however, read thoughts outright. Impulses, emotions, unspoken desires. Inconclusive needs further testing. Subjects seem compelled to do things that make me happy or more comfortable. Contradictions. When I wanted them to confess, they were honest about their feelings rather than stating what I wished to hear. Perhaps they can resist if they feel strongly enough about something. Izuku paused here. Something about that statement bothered him, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He jotted down another couple notes in the cramped margins before moving on. An order spoken out loud, untested. Izuku didn't remember ordering them to do anything outright. He would need to give it a try when he got the chance. Something small that perhaps they wouldn't normally do, but that wouldn't make them terribly uncomfortable. Or maybe it should be something that would make them uncomfortable, just to test if they can resist it. The thought made Izuku sick to his stomach and he decided vehemently that he was going to make this as painless as possible. Hopefully, nothing would come of it. He didn't want that kind of power over anyone. Spoken requests. Inconclusive needs further testing. I requested for subjects to leave my side. They only complied when I truly wished them to leave, when my words and my desires aligned. So, subjects are more likely to comply with requests than usual, but can still refuse with some effort. A spoken request with a desired outcome. Inconclusive, needs further testing. A spoken request without a desired outcome. Inconclusive, needs further testing. Izuku sighed, resting his face against his folded arms and effectively blocking out the room and the irritating, inconclusive notes sitting defiantly on distressed paper. He wished he'd been paying closer attention, but the past 2 days were so muddled up in his head that he couldn't make heads or tails of it. A swell of emotion built up in Izuku's stomach to crowd his throat, and he was dangerously close to crying again. He was getting nowhere. He needed to talk to someone. All Might came to mind first, but with a prickling behind his eyes, Izuku remembered that he was still busy with the police investigating the mission and wouldn't be back for a few days. Also, Izuku didn't want to bother him with something so trivial after his best friend died. He would handle this on his own before he bothered Toshinori, who had it so much worse. Aizawa-sensei came second, but he hadn't been terribly concerned the previous day and was just as busy as All Might. Maybe he didn't realize how serious this all was. He'd seemed unbothered, as if he felt Izuku could handle it. Izuku wished for once that Aizawa had a little less faith in him. He rolled his head to the side to regard his phone, briefly considering texting Uraraka or Iida. But it sat still and silent, no notification light in sight, and that stung for reasons he couldn't quite examine on top of everything else. He reached for it listlessly but dropped his hand just before touching the smooth surface. He didn't want to bother them either. His mind wandered down darker roads. He wondered how Eri-chan was doing. He hadn't been able to see her at all yet, and it was eating away at him inside. Her fear, her grief, haunted him. Such a young face shouldn't bear such terrible expressions, as if the shadow of her captor still hovered over her like a dark cloud. Izuku didn't know how to help her. He saved her, but it didn't really feel like it. It didn't feel like enough. Tagata-senpai had also been out of sight for days. Sir's death hung heavily on his mind as well, and he hadn't spoken to Izuku at all since the rescue. Izuku could imagine all too clearly what he must be feeling. If All Might died. All Might wouldn't die, he promised. Pressure built behind Izuku's eyes, throbbing in time with his temple. He didn't want to think about this. He didn't know how to make it stop. A sharp pain in his midsection accompanied by a heady wave of nausea reminded him without mercy that he hadn't eaten anything at all except for a few measly bites of pancake, the rest of which sat ruined and cold on his coffee table. It only made him feel worse that he'd wasted all the effort Bakugo put into it for his sake. Still, despite the cramping in his abdomen, he couldn't bring himself to move, because getting up meant he would have to go to the kitchen and face everyone again. Was that a better alternative than stewing in his spiraling thoughts? He couldn't decide. With a sigh, Izuku flipped his notebook closed so he wouldn't have to look at it anymore. He would talk to Aizawa in the morning and maybe get a head start on figuring out how the quirk worked so he could help his friends. For now, he just wanted to pass out and forget everything for a while. If only he could. Already he could feel the nightmares that had plagued him for too long hovering on the edge of his exhausted consciousness, those that had been blessedly silent last night when he'd slept with, when he'd been held by. A soft knock startled Izuku, heart jumping in his chest uncomfortably as he whipped around to stare at the door. Immediately he felt conflicted, dread and anticipation flooding him equally at the possibilities of who might be looking for him. He needn't have fretted. Without having to answer, the knob turned and a sheepish Kirishima peeked around the frame. Izuku relaxed, the dark shadows of his mind receding minutely at the friendly face. A friendly face that immediately crumpled in concern when Kirishima saw the state of the room and Izuku himself. "Midorya, can I come in?" "Why yes, of course," Izuku said in a rush, pushing himself to a seated position, utterly relieved for the distraction. Kirishima frowned before shouldering the door open, carefully stepping past the piles of discarded paper. Izuku was surprised to see him carry 2 steaming bowls, and instantly his stomach complained loudly for the abuse he'd put it through the last 48 hours. Kirishima's brows rose on his forehead and he laughed at the rumble, placing a bowl in front of Izuku and taking a seat opposite him. "Thank you," Izuku mumbled, pulling an amazing-looking pork cutlet bowl closer and immediately digging in, groaning as he ate for the first time in far too long. Maybe it was that he hadn't eaten for a while, but it was unaccountably delicious. For a moment, Izuku's mind went blissfully blank and Kirishima likewise remained silent, eating his food and giving Izuku all the time he needed. Izuku felt Kirishima's eyes on him, but couldn't bring himself to acknowledge it just yet, not until he'd eaten the very last grain of rice. Mournfully, he stared down in the bowl, wishing more would magically appear. Alas. Do you feel better? Yes, Izuku answered, remembering with some embarrassment that he had an audience. His mind was clearing now that he wasn't so hungry, and now he had to wonder what compelled Kirishima to bring him food. Don't get him wrong, it was nice, but they weren't all that close. Why? Kirishima's brows drew together, his smile turning a bit sad. No one has seen you all day. We were worried. He closed his mouth, hesitated. Then tried again. I know it's been rough. I just wanted to check in. Like, that mission was really awful, you know. I mean, Kirishima fidgeted, a smile struggling to remain on his face and avoiding Izuku's eye. Tetsu and Bakugo have been helping me deal in. I just want you to know that I'm here for you, man. If you wanted to talk, or whatever. For a full minute, Izuku didn't respond and Kirishima backtracked a little, flustered. Izuku watched with some fascination as Kirishima became animated. I mean, it's alright if you don't. It's just, it only went down a couple days ago and the girls haven't been talking to anyone. Tsuyu is doing her best to help Uraraka and Iida is hovering over them both. Hey, Uraraka's been acting annoyed, but I think she's enjoying the attention. Huh, so that's why neither of them had tried to contact him. Immediately Izuku felt bad for thinking poorly of them. Uraraka had been so upset that morning, Izuku should be there for her right now. What kind of friend was he? He wasn't the only one going through a hard time. He looked down. Maybe I should. Kirishima interrupted, waving his hands nervously. Best leave them alone for a while. I think Tsuyu has it covered. She looked pretty scary when I tried to talk to them myself. Besides, what about you? How are you doing with that whole love quirk thing? Kirishima laughed awkwardly and tried to fill the silence as Izuku's stomach dropped. Bakugo practically assaulted me in the hall and ordered me to bring you food. I mean, why didn't he just do it? Shouldn't the two of them be glued to your side right now, Midorya? Izuku slumped back against his bed, looking at the remains of the delicious lunch he'd just had. Kacchan had made this for him. Even after Izuku was so awful to him. What about Todoroki? Kirishima was starting to look really concerned, leaning closer and lowering his voice. I didn't see him, but Bakugo stalked off toward the garden after giving the food to me. Todoroki likes to hang out there. Izuku mumbled. He had seen the boy in the garden more than once himself, now that he thought about it. Bakugo noticed that. They knew each other so well. Hey man, what's wrong? You know none of this is your fault, right? Izuku laughed dryly. I think I messed up. I might have ruined everything. He shivered even though it wasn't cold in the room. Abruptly he missed having someone close to him, missed having arms wrapped around him. His eyes flickered to Kirishima and away, but it was too awkward to ask for such a thing, though he was certain the other boy would. It would help, but it wasn't exactly what he wanted right now. At Kirishima's prompting, Izuku told him briefly what happened, stuttering to a halt with a furious blush when he got to the part about the beep. Kirishima raised a curious brow but didn't push. Kirishima, to Izuku's surprise, looked more impressed than distressed at the news. Wow, Bakubro finally admitted that he liked Todoroki. About time. What, dude, they've been dancing around each other for ages. I don't think anyone else noticed, but after the whole kidnapping incident, Bakubro's really opened up to me. Mostly cursing, but I think I've got the hang of his mood swings now, he trailed off thoughtfully with a small smirk, amused. Hagakure wasn't wrong. That fight with Todoroki during the tournament really messed Bakugo up and he hasn't shut up about him since. It's almost as much as he complains about you. I am surprised they went as far as sleeping together already, but who am I to judge? Izuku really didn't know how to interpret that. He shook his head. I think you're missing the point. I made them confess before they were ready. Todoroki looked like he was going to be sick. Yeah, but Bakugo stopped you, right? Hiroshima said easily. Izuku nodded slowly, and Todoroki seemed honest. It sounds like this might be a good wake-up call if he thought that Bakugo wasn't being serious with him, Hiroshima said gently. Maybe this is a good thing. I'm just saying, it doesn't sound like you can actually make them do anything they truly don't want to. Quote. Maybe, Izuku said doubtfully, rubbing his eyes roughly. But that doesn't change the fact that this quirk has forced me between them. Has it? I dunno about that. Hiroshima rested his cheek on his palm, watching Izuku closely with a reassuring smile. I'm not sure exactly what's going on with you three, but I do know my bro, and he only ever seems to react when it comes to the two of you. Just, maybe give him a chance. And I could be just imagining it, but Todoroki smiles a lot more when you're around. Izuku shook his head sharply. Hiroshima just didn't get it. He wasn't there when Bakugo fought with Izuku after All Might took down All for One. He wasn't there in middle school when Kacchan told him to die. He wasn't there in elementary school when Kacchan turned his back on Izuku. Kacchan hates me, Hiroshima. He's hated me for ages and you said it yourself, he only ever complains about me. Wait, that didn't sound quite right. But Izuku was on a roll. And yeah, maybe Todoroki had gotten a little more friendly over the months, but nothing that would make the way he beeped Izuku any less shocking. Besides, why would Todoroki like me when he clearly has feelings for Kacchan? They're together. No, I don't know why the quirk made them fixate on me, but I just have to ride this out so that everything can go back to normal and they can start to date for real without me messing things up. Hiroshima fell silent, face unreadable. Do you really believe that? He said eventually. Izuku didn't have an answer for him, just knew he was right, lips set in a stubborn line. Hiroshima sighed, getting to his feet. I'm going to go find Tetsu and maybe have a spar. Do you want to come? When Izuku shook his head, Hiroshima gave a small smile and turned to leave, empty bowls in hand. Just before he closed the door behind him, he gave Izuku one last look. I may not have known Bakugo for as long as you, but he doesn't give the time of day to people that don't matter to him. Come to think of it, neither does Todoroki. They already focused on you long before they were affected by any quirk, and I think that says something. Just think about it. As the door closed softly behind him, a stunned Izuku realized that he wouldn't be able to do anything but. After several silent moments, he pulled the notebook back to his side and flipped it to his notes. With a shaking hand, he wrote. I wanted Kacchan to hold me. I wanted Todoroki to beat me. Why didn't they resist? 3 hours earlier, Katsuki seethed, teeth grinding together so hard he was half convinced they were producing the sparks dancing in the shadowed grass beneath his heels. But no, it was his clenched fists that caused the light and incessant popping he couldn't hear over the sliding of his jaw. He wanted to destroy everything in his wake, to burn. Instead he poured the hot, humiliating ache in his chest into his pounding steps, taking him farther and farther from the source of his ire. If Deku wanted him gone, then fine, he'd give him all the goddamn space he wanted. How dare he? How dare Deku lie to his face like that, when he could feel that Deku didn't mean what he said? Somewhere in the back of Katsuki's mind the fact that he could do such a thing was alarming. But the overwhelming forefront was glad of it, because it meant that he could love without fear. How dare he push Katsuki away, look at him like Katsuki was some sort of damsel that needed protection. It was an expression Katsuki was unfortunately used to seeing, and it grated at him every single time. He did not need that nerd's goddamn protection. He knew what he wanted, and what he wanted was that thrilling defiance in Deku's scowl, that determined look that always set his blood ablaze and made Katsuki's heart race with excitement at the sheer challenge to be better. He wanted the blind faith in him that he could never dissuade from Deku's determined eyes no matter how much Katsuki tried to push him away. He wanted that pure smile Deku blinded him with when Katsuki did something to make him proud. Katsuki wanted that with more passion than he'd ever experienced in his life, and passion had never been a deficiency of his. He did not want whatever pitying bullshit that had been written all over Deku's stupid teary face. Damn it, Katsuki screamed, heedless of the explosion of startled birds his voice incited. With every step he took the ache in his chest got worse, and the shitty part was that he knew it was Deku's fault. If he would have just let Katsuki stay by his side and let himself be happy for once in his goddamn life, then none of them would be feeling like this. Even now, with the awful indignation behind his sternum, there was the insistent urge to turn right back around and soothe the frown off of Deku's face with soft touches and everything the nerd liked. He would, too, was half thinking about doing just that, spinning on his heel and pulling Deku into his arms, to give him all the contact he wanted, his lies be damned. It had felt amazing to finally do what Katsuki had always wished he was capable of doing, because for some strange reason he felt absolutely none of the usual shame or fear in doing so. He didn't because he knew that Deku liked it, that he wanted it, and hadn't felt the revulsion towards Katsuki that Katsuki always expected, that he knew he deserved. But why? Why had he never done this before? If it was so easy, why? Katsuki's steps slowed, a frown pulling at his face as he looked at the ground without seeing. A slow, creeping dread was welling up in his chest as, without Deku there to distract him, Katsuki found himself replaying the past 24 hours slowly in reverse, starting with a very unplanned, embarrassing confession. What exactly was he doing? His eyes narrowed as he tried to pinpoint exactly when he went absolutely nuts and started spouting all of the bullshit he'd been holding back for longer than he'd care to admit, even to himself. But it was slippery, smoke slipping through his clenched fist. All he knew was that he wanted more than anything to wrap his arms around Deku again and nip the pathetic pout off his face. At the same time, he struggled to remember why he never had in the first place. Why had he never taken that step before when it felt so good? He couldn't remember for the life of him. Quit. Shitty brat. I don't. Goddamn weakling. Stay in here until you learn. A small twinge in his chest, so distant but familiar for some reason, made Katsuki pause, but it was banished with the crystal clear, radiant memory of Deku's smile when he'd tasted Katsuki's cooking for the first time. It felt incredible to make Deku feel good, like a hit of the most potent drug. To finally say the name he'd long ago lost the right to use, to finally touch those stupid freckles, to find out precisely the way they tasted on his warm skin, to have him trust Katsuki again when Katsuki knew he didn't dare. Love. Then quit sniveling and get ing deserve it. Katsuki's chest clenched, but he wasn't sure why. Words echoed in the back of his mind along with all reasons this was a terrible idea, but he just couldn't pin any of it down. He was more concerned with the expression that had been on Deku's face when he'd left him. When Deku had thrown them out. Deku hadn't trusted him, had he? He didn't seem to believe a single word that came out of Katsuki's mouth. Katsuki's head spun, something insistent niggling at the back of his mind. Something wasn't right. Deku hadn't believed him because a fog was lifting from Katsuki's mind, the insistent pull in his chest lessening the longer he was away from Deku. He groaned, events replaying behind his clenched eyelids as all new humiliation burned at the back of his tongue. What the had he been doing? Saying. He'd told Deku he loved him. He'd called his name and fed him like he was some sort of stray, fussed over him and staked his claim in front of everyone, practically started pissing to mark his territory. He'd finally put voice to his attraction to Todoroki. Katsuki froze, eyes going wide. Todoroki. He looked behind him sharply, as if the boy might have followed him all the way out here in his irate retreat. But of course, he was nowhere to be found. Shit, he ed up. Katsuki growled in frustration as he remembered the broken look on Todoroki's face when Deku rejected him, the wounded sound he'd made. Stupid, shitty Deku, did he have to be so freaking harsh? And why had Katsuki said all that? Katsuki needed to find him. He shouldn't have left him like that, no matter how pissed he'd been. If Katsuki had learned anything about the boy in the time he'd been seducing him, he refused to think the word dating, when he wasn't even sure himself what they were doing, just that it was something. It was that Todoroki was ridiculously sensitive. Though insults would slide off of him like water, he had a nasty habit of self-flagellating every time he perceived he'd made a mistake or hurt someone else. It was both frustrating and endearing, though Katsuki would swear up and down that it was only the former. After only a handful of minutes searching, Katsuki found Todoroki, and the panic that sat like bile at the back of Katsuki's throat receded in a tide of relief. Katsuki scowled grumpily. The moody bastard was nothing if not predictable. Todoroki was sitting in the same spot he always did when he disappeared to sulk. A small alcove behind the gym where a garden had once been cultivated, though it had long overgrown since the person who made it graduated some years ago. The fairer boy was curled up on a bench, knees drawn to his chest and arms resting on them listlessly, gaze far away. Light speckled over his pale skin in the light breeze, the sycamores overhead swaying gently. Something tight relaxed in Katsuki's stomach as he stopped in front of him with a crunch of dried leaves, but Todoroki's blank gaze didn't waver, not even to notice Katsuki's approach. "Oi!" Half and half. No response. Katsuki sighed but wasn't terribly surprised. This is not the first time he'd found Todoroki like this. Katsuki sat down with a huff, letting himself calm down while he waited. The first time had been right after the tournament, one of the worst days of Katsuki's life, at least, it had felt that way at the time. He'd had more experiences since then, and had enough self-awareness to realize how badly he'd overreacted. Even if it was his right to walk away, to not accept. Even if it was their fault what happened next. Katsuki had been so angry. He'd been looked down on, silenced and chained, forced to receive an award he didn't deserve. Not only had Deku once again outshone Katsuki, but Katsuki was found unworthy by Todoroki, one of the most powerful people he'd ever known. The rejection had burned Katsuki in a way he'd never quite experienced since Wimpy Deku had looked Katsuki in the eye and said, "You can't stop me." That day had been the beginning of Katsuki's fascination with Deku. And on the day of the tournament, the broken look in Todoroki's eyes when he'd refused to use his fire for Katsuki was the beginning of Katsuki's fascination with him. No one refused to acknowledge Katsuki, not ever. Not until then. But Todoroki hadn't even looked at him the day he'd found him on this dilapidated bench overgrown with flowers and weeds, arms wrapped protectively around himself. His arrogance was long gone. The fire in his eyes that had been so prevalent even behind his stoic exterior snuffed out with a resignation that enraged Katsuki in a way he couldn't understand, because it looked like he'd given up. Such a person with so much raw power and talent wasn't allowed to give up, especially not before Katsuki had overcome everything he could dish out. Katsuki wanted to see it. Wanted to see those fiery eyes directed at him. Wanted to see Todoroki give Katsuki his all because that's what he deserved, damn it. Katsuki had been too angry then to do more than turn on his heel and stalk away, the numerous wounds on Todoroki's bandaged skin, the pathetic look on his face enough to cool even Katsuki's hot temper and realize that even if he tried to provoke him, Todoroki was too pathetic to give him what he wanted. He hadn't examined the emotion that hung heavy in his chest at the sight then. It would be a long time before he did. Over the following months Katsuki found himself wandering past that damned bench when Todoroki pulled one of his disappearing acts. Sometimes Todoroki was there and sometimes not, but when he was it was always the same, hands resting listlessly at his sides, shoulders slumped, resigned and painfully alone. Even outside of those quiet, secret moments, Katsuki watched Todoroki. He'd learned more about the boy little by little, the way he seemed to shrink from praise, the way he couldn't stand to be touched even by those who meant him no harm, the way Todoroki's usually empty eyes slowly lit up when he finally started to make friends. Katsuki wasn't an idiot. He knew what child abuse looked like disturbingly well, and Todoroki had it written on his forehead in blood for all that he tried to be so damn stoic. Not that it was hard to make the leap, what with that bastard endeavor haunting his son's shadow like a particularly vengeful firefly, or the way Todoroki had become visibly healthier and less grim when the students were moved to the dorms, or his unique eyes darkening with storm clouds every time Endeavor imposed his scowling mug. It was part of the reason Katsuki had been drawn to Todoroki. Instead of becoming a belligerent asshole as Katsuki had, he'd closed himself off like a steel trap. It made it all the more incredible when he'd ended up letting Katsuki in anyway. Even if the damn fool didn't realize what it meant. It was after Katsuki had been kidnapped by Shigaraki, after surviving that hell, being rescued by those suicidal idiots, after Katsuki's only hero's heartbreaking fall because of Katsuki and the realization that Deku had been chosen over him again, that he found Todoroki in the same damn spot. Katsuki had been fleeing from the nightmares that plagued him more than they ever had, even worse than the ones that had driven him from his bed after that slime monster nearly killed him, worse than those that came before that, from a darker part of his childhood. But the second he'd spied Todoroki's reliable brooding, all of that faded away to nothing as a tightness he didn't know he'd been carrying eased away. That was when he knew that what he felt for Todoroki was more than idle curiosity. That kidnapping and subsequent rescue had solidified a few things for Katsuki. 1. He had a best friend despite having done nothing to deserve it. Hiroshima hadn't let him down once, and Katsuki could finally accept that he never would. With that realization, he was finally able to start to open up to others. Pikachu, bubblegum, even round cheeks was getting under his skin and he was okay with that. 2. All Might may have chosen Deku to be his successor, but Katsuki was still the most powerful challenge that Deku had to overcome. Deku proved it to him every day by his unbending faith, his dogged chase after Katsuki's back as if he were truly worthy of such admiration. Katsuki could help Deku become what All Might wanted for him, and that was starting to be enough for Katsuki to finally let go of the past, to turn around and reach out the hand he'd always wanted to extend beneath the hurt and the jealousy, because Deku had always been there for him, whether he deserved it or not. And now this, Todoroki sitting alone as if he had no one at all in the world after having helped save Katsuki's life, after mirroring the volatile boy in more ways than Katsuki was willing to admit. It was time for his solitude to end. Katsuki, after months of silent observation, walked up to him and, well, challenged him to a fight. Hey, he may have been having a lot of life-changing realizations, but he was still Katsuki Bakugo, damn it, and he didn't do mushy confessions. It had been rough. Todoroki had been rightly surprised, but didn't back down when Katsuki threw himself at him. They ended up not using their quirks, just exchanging blow for blow, and damn, he was stronger than his scrawny limbs suggested, but Katsuki was still better. It was messy, primal in the way Katsuki needed, and when they ended on a stalemate, Katsuki pinned to the ground with a seething Todoroki panting furiously over him with that delicious fire in his eyes, it was so similar to Deku's that it made Katsuki's grin sharpen with pure pleasure. Yes, that was more like it. A different kind of heat consumed Katsuki's blood then, one he'd never allowed himself to feel for anyone before. He'd never bothered with romance or any of that crap, too driven by his goals to see anyone else as anything other than an obstacle to overcome. But right then, with the slighter boy seething over him, looking upset but so much more alive, Katsuki did something he had never, ever allowed himself to do in his life. He submitted. Shut up. He hadn't lost. He believed with every fiber of his being that he was still stronger, could have easily changed their positions and taken the over-emotional boy out. But that wasn't what he needed. What they both needed. With a soft smirk, Katsuki relaxed beneath Todoroki, letting him hold him down without taking his red gaze off Todoroki's enraged face. The utter shock that overtook those usually cold features was priceless and would be burned into Katsuki's memory for the rest of his life. Gently, Katsuki reached up and brushed his knuckles across Todoroki's damaged cheek, just beneath his widened eye. He didn't miss the flinch, as if Todoroki had never been touched gently before, especially not there. Anger flashed hot in Katsuki's blood for whoever did this to Todoroki, but he didn't let it surface, simply running his fingers through Todoroki's sweat-slicked hair until he too relaxed, just as Katsuki did for the stray cats that always found him. Still confused, but no longer desperate, Todoroki eased his hold, looking down at Katsuki like he'd never seen him properly before. Then Katsuki leaned up and beeped him. Then Katsuki did more. He continued to find Todoroki in the months following, the certification test, the remedial courses, the drama in between as Izuku and the others started to come back looking more and more haggard, and Todoroki had let him. Their relationship outside of that didn't change. They were still rivals. Katsuki still gave him shit when he ate up, and Todoroki gave as good as he got. It was how they were. He'd thought the other boy had understood, but if the scene with Deku earlier demonstrated anything, it was that Todoroki absolutely hadn't. Maybe it was Katsuki's fault that he didn't realize sooner that Todoroki would have zero experience with something like this. Though he was Katsuki's first as well, so he really didn't have an excuse for being such an idiot. Looked like he was going to have to spell it out for him. As many times as it takes. A small movement at Katsuki's side had him paying attention to the here and now, letting go of the memories in favor of the wind against his face and the buzzing of the insects on the warm summer day. Bakugo, Todoroki finally said, blinking out of his thoughts and finally noticing Katsuki sitting next to him, idly stroking his shoulder and waiting for him to come around. There was little point in trying to snap Todoroki out of his thoughts when he got like this, though Katsuki had never explicitly tried. A man was entitled to his own thoughts, after all. Welcome back, Candy Cane, Katsuki said gruffly, flicking a lock of crimson hair from Todoroki's forehead without looking at him. Quote. You never call me by my name. Todoroki stated the obvious, settling his chin back on his knees and looking out into the garden again. He didn't go anywhere this time, leaning into Katsuki's touch as if it grounded him. Katsuki once again wondered how he could always do this, allow Katsuki so close and not realize that there was something between them. The thought itched like a shitty sweater, but he set it aside for now because he was feeling generous. Katsuki grumbled under his breath, answering the unspoken question. Names are important. You said Midoriya's name. Quote. Yeah, Midoriya is special to you. Katsuki peered into the other boy's face, trying to discern what he was getting at. What's your point? Todoroki didn't meet his eye. This is weird, isn't it? Why are we both after Midoriya all of a sudden? That was a good point. All he knew was that whatever had been stopping Bakugo was gone. I don't really know. We probably were hit with something. The thought irked him, because he didn't like to be controlled. No one controlled Katsuki, not the slime villain, not Shigaraki, and definitely not. He sighed, allowing the toxic thought to drift away. Whatever it is, Todoroki said slowly, I like it. Todoroki hunched into himself further, his brows furrowing. I used to be afraid to reach out and touch anyone. But especially those I liked. Now I can. I don't remember why I never did before. Katsuki rolled that one around in his head. It was the same way he'd been feeling, as if all the impulses he'd ever held back around Deku and Todoroki had been set free of the inhibitions he'd held his whole life. Quickly, he catalogued his feelings about the others, concluding that aside from Todoroki and Deku, everyone else can still themselves. Except maybe Kirishima. But then again, he was the exception to a lot of things. Todoroki huffed, a faint, genuine smile lightening his features. Midoriya, I didn't know I felt this way about him. But I guess he was always easier to be around than other people. Like, when he smiles. Todoroki trailed off, a small glimmer in his eye, and Bakugo laughed internally. He made an agreeing sound, unable to argue with that. And also, it's easier to touch you, too. What's happening to us, Bakugo? I don't care, Katsuki decided. He liked how he felt now. There was something freeing about whatever they'd been hit with. It made it so much easier to say what he meant, to finally go after the things he wanted, as if a terrible, crippling wound had been lifted from his heart. That child is so better than everyone else. You don't deserve weak. So violent, probably be a villain. Such a shame. All that talent, but he's still so. Stop it, Kacchan. Silence. Katsuki blinked, his thoughts quieting as contentment filled his chest. He felt at peace, something he didn't experience very often in his life but for brief moments when he could take Todoroki apart, when Todoroki let him, when Deku smiled at him without reserve. How long have you loved Midoriya? Katsuki took a long time to answer, but when he did his words flowed like water, the rasping growl of his voice softening into new shapes as nothing stopped him from saying what he wanted. It was a strange feeling, but he wasn't about to complain. Dunno, maybe forever. For a long time I thought I hated him, but now I'm not so sure that's what it was. Resentment, maybe. Jealousy, definitely. But he'd never hated the nerd. Not really. You really like me? Todoroki asked, and Katsuki didn't even try to hide his irritated scoff, nor the light dusting of red on his cheeks. How many times was he going to have to say it? That's what I said, half and half. You're thick. Todoroki hummed consideringly, ignoring his insults as easily as he always did, eyes distant as if he couldn't really understand what Katsuki was thinking. There was that adorable look of consternation back on Todoroki's face and it was distracting. Katsuki grimaced at himself for the obnoxious thought, for being such a sap even if only in his own mind. So, we both like Midorya. Yeah, and you like me. We're together. Yeah, Katsuki said, losing his patience. Was this guy just going to repeat the obvious all damn day? He looked like he was still having trouble wrapping his head around it. And I guess, I want you both. Katsuki's brows rose on his forehead. He guessed. Well, at least Todoroki was finally getting it. Again, there was the feeling that what they were contemplating was impossible. Probably a million reasons why something like this would never actually work under any other circumstances. People, memories standing in the way. But for the love of everything unholy he couldn't think of a single one. He got the feeling he was better off for it. So, what exactly are we going to do now? Midorya rejected us. Katsuki rolled his eyes. What do you think, Candy Cane? We're going to make Deku ours. But, listen, you felt it, right? He wants us to. Shitty nerd never was good at lying. Todoroki fell silent, thoughtful, and lifted a single finger to his lips. Katsuki was gratified to see the determination growing in Todoroki's face, and offered him a confident grin. Katsuki knew what he wanted, and that was the two most singular people in his life to be his. Right now, with the unexpected gift he'd been given, nothing could stop him from making that happen. Chapter text. Izuku couldn't breathe, eyes wide, lungs cramping from exertion and heart a battering ram against his ribs. He ran through the dark. He was in a forest, one that looked devastatingly familiar. Black trees surrounded him on all sides against a sky filled with acrid smoke, closing in until the air was heavy with it. Izuku was running away from something terrifying. He was running towards something even more so. No, 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 he chanted, but his lungs were too tight to say it aloud, though he dearly wished he could scream his denial into the hazy sky above just to hear something other than the racing of his own desperate heart. It's too late, a voice answered back, and it sounded despairingly like Kacchan. And then he was there, right in front of Izuku, but he couldn't reach him as he was yanked into the arms of Shigaraki, the amorphous villain pulling Kacchan against his body covetously, tauntingly, before fading to darkness, pulling a wide-eyed Kacchan with him. You're not enough. You're never enough. Did you think you could? Save me, another voice continued, young and pleading. Save me, please. It was Kota, hat gone, eyes wide and teary and scrapes all over his pale skin. Over him stood a horrifying shadow, the silhouette of muscles beyond any sane reasoning, massive hands coming up to smother the small boy. Muscular looked up with a manic grin and squeezed. Kota screamed. Kota! Izuku choked, lifting his arm too slow. But he was slammed into the ground and he could feel himself breaking apart like a dry clump of clay, bones disintegrating in familiar agony. Above him, a slim man laughed, the lower half of his face obscured by a mask. Overhaul's cruel eyes narrowed with glee as his fist around Izuku's neck grew tighter. Poor, pathetic boy, this is your fault. All these people hurt because of you. Do you like watching them suffer? Vision blackening with suffocation and tears, Izuku just barely saw Eri-chan peeking around her father's back, a cold, dead look in her eyes, and he realized with a shock that she wasn't with him. He couldn't win without her. He couldn't save her without her power because he wasn't enough. He reached for her with his mangled arm, but she stepped away, young, beautiful face crumpling in disgust. Now you want to save me. It's too late. Chiaki laughed, and then he was changing, becoming paler, his hair longer, until Shigaraki was the one with his hand around Izuku's throat, one finger teasingly waving in the air, the only thing saving Izuku from death. He smiled, cracked skin flaking and gleeful. Then he was staying, manic fever in his eyes, then all for one's destroyed face, the terrifying emptiness of a Nomu. Kacchan and Todoroki, but this time they weren't smiling, weren't looking at him with gentleness as they squeezed the life out of him. In Kacchan's eyes was the same anger he'd shown in middle school, in Todoroki's the same cornered look he'd worn when Izuku talked with him for the first time. As one, they whispered as the world went black, why are you doing this to us? Izuku woke with a gasp, blinded by the rushing of his panic and unable to breathe past the lump in his throat. A dream, it was a dream. Kota was fine. Kacchan was fine. Eri was safe in the hospital. He hadn't failed, it was just a nightmare. He was safe. Shish, someone whispered, and Izuku fought to come out of his panic, to see his surroundings. A soft touch drifted through his hair and he flinched, only able to see a fist coming for his face, a flash of crimson and fire. It was just a dream, Bakugo whispered gruffly, and at the sound of his voice Izuku calmed, pulse evening out. Kacchan. His vision cleared well enough to see by the glow of his All Might lamp. It was dark outside. Izuku didn't remember falling asleep. He looked up to find Bakugo sitting beside him on his bed, a notebook propped open on his knee. He didn't pull his hand away when Izuku flinched and continued to brush through his hair absently, eyes glued to his work. Izuku blinked, trying to clear the tears and grit from his eyes. That soft touch must have been what woke him. Shush, you'll wake Candy Cane. Todoroki mumbled, and Izuku tensed as he felt a shift against his chest. He looked down to find the other boy nuzzling into his side with their legs tangled together, pulling Izuku closer and rubbing his chest clumsily. Izuku relaxed, warmth blossoming behind his sternum as some knot of tension in him began to unravel. Todoroki made a pleased noise before snuggling closer. When did they come in? Or better yet, why were they here after what Izuku did to them earlier? Somehow, he couldn't find it in himself to think on it too deeply, not when he was so comfortable. It was a welcome reprieve from the fear on the edge of his dreams, a fear he could feel receding with Todoroki's every steady breath and the sweep of Bakugo's fingers. Go back to sleep, Bakugo said, the scritch of pen on paper a quiet lullaby. Izuku couldn't tell which one of them he was talking to. Probably both. With a huff, Bakugo swept his hand over Izuku's face, closing his eyes and blocking his disoriented stare. An overwhelming feeling of safety engulfed Izuku, and when Bakugo pulled his hand away he found that his eyes remained closed. Sleep beckoned and Izuku didn't resist its call, letting himself drift away beneath Todoroki's warm weight. He didn't dream again that night. Plus Ultra. All Might's voice blared through the room and Izuku groaned, "Seize the day, young hero. Go beyond." Plus Ultra. Clumsily, Izuku waved his arm around until he could slap the button on his alarm clock, silencing his morning pep talk. Usually, the thought of another day at UA would make him smile, but he could barely bring himself to move. It was a school day. He had to get up. Plus Ultra. His second alarm clock blared on the other side of the room, and Izuku forced his eyes open this time, knowing that if he didn't make himself get out of bed to shut it off, he was going to end up late. Muzzily, he pushed himself upright from his sprawl on his stomach, wiping the drool from his face and getting clumsily from the bed. Tottering to the other side of the room, tripping over loose papers on the way, he pushed All Might's plastic head down with an affectionate pat before turning around to stare blankly at his empty room. Wait, had last night been a dream? Izuku felt a little more awake as his stomach tangled into knots when he remembered how he'd acted. But neither boy was even here, so maybe he'd just imagined it. He bit his lip. Just the thought of them being here had banished his nightmares, so he was grateful either way, even if it didn't quell his guilt all that much. A soft knock at his door had Izuku jolting out of his daze. "Midorya." Todoroki's quiet voice came through the wood, hesitant. "Why yes," he said nervously, looking around himself at the wreck that was his bedroom, that he was. Even his hair was in more of a rioting mess than usual. A flash of calloused fingers gently working through his tangles had him coughing into his fist. "It's 7:30, we're going to be late." "All right," Izuku said loudly, scrambling to get himself together. He threw on his clothes, rubbing the grit from his eyes as he gathered his school stuff. Man, he'd really made a mess in here. As an afterthought, he snatched his notebook from the floor, shoving it into his backpack in case he had another revelation at some point in the day. First things first, he needed to chat with Aizawa. Todoroki blinked muzzily at him as he opened the door and Izuku just gaped for a second. Then Todoroki smiled slightly, eyes sharpening, and Izuku had to force his gaze away. Aha. Good morning Todoroki. Where's Kacchan? Todoroki looked at him for a moment longer before adjusting his shirt sleeve and walking slowly down the hall. He's in the kitchen, finishing up breakfast. Huh, he really cooks a lot, doesn't he? Izuku said, pushing his awkwardness aside for now and falling into step beside the other boy. Izuku didn't really remember Bakugo cooking quite this much, though he could occasionally be found doing so, if one were looking for it. He always got so defensive and shoved everyone out of the kitchen when that happened. Yeah, he's usually more secretive about it, though, Todoroki said thoughtfully. A small flash of guilt hit Izuku at that. Was Bakugo doing this because of the love quirk? But that didn't make sense. Izuku hadn't particularly wanted him to cook, or anything. Don't do that, Todoroki said, pausing in his stride. They were at the top of the stairs now, and Izuku could hear voices in the common area, too soft to make out. Izuku paused as well, wondering what he meant. Todoroki looked at him from beneath his lashes, gaze piercing, and Izuku was abruptly reminded of another time Todoroki looked at him like that. Right before, Izuku's eyes fluttered down to Todoroki's lips and startled when the other boy licked them, gaze darkening. And it's Shoto. He made his way down the stairs, leaving Izuku choking on air. There was no way he could call him that, no way. By the time Izuku made it down the stairs, the common room was nearly empty save for Todoroki, Uraraka and Tsuyu. Uraraka stood by the door with the other girl, looking conflicted, but the second she saw Izuku she brightened, waving with a happy smile. Oh, she looked a lot better. Izuku was glad. Deku, she called sweetly, jogging to meet him at the couches, Tsuyu waiting patiently for her at the door. You're late, sleepy head. Homeroom starts in 10 minutes. She paused as she reached him, concern dimming her smile when she caught sight of the dark shadows beneath his eyes. Did you sleep at all? Ah, I did, I'm fine, Izuku lied. Well, it wasn't technically a lie. He had slept, but only after waking from that awful nightmare at who knew what time in the morning. But that was a daily occurrence for him at this point. He avoided her eyes with an awkward smile when he remembered just how he woke up. Unless that had been a dream as well. Well, come on, we'll be late, Uraraka urged, grabbing onto Izuku's arm and tugging him playfully. Hey, hands off, Bakugo called, walking through the door from the kitchen, a container in hand. Todoroki trailed after him, munching on a bun of some sort. Uraraka pouted and made a rude face. Don't tell me what to do. Deku's my best friend. Yeah, well, he's my. Bakugo scowled, cutting himself off as Izuku's heart skipped an unsteady beat. Just get out of here, round cheeks. He's gotta eat first. But what about class? Uraraka said uncertainly, giving Izuku a critical look as if she wasn't really disagreeing. Worry about yourself first, Aizawa said drolly as he strolled around the corner. Uraraka jumped, not having noticed the man come in, spinning Izuku around with her to face him. Aizawa looked as unimpressed as ever. Besides, I have something to chat about with these three. Off you go. Uraraka's pout was back with force, glancing between the three boys in discontent. Fine, she complained, releasing Izuku's arm and making her way back to Tsuyu, casting concerned looks over her shoulder that clearly said, we'll talk about this later. Izuku smiled uncertainly, not sure exactly what he was going to say. Tsuyu said something to the morose girl that made her smile as they left, the door shutting softly behind them, cutting off their laughter. Izuku looked to Aizawa with determination when they were alone, but Bakugo's irritated che distracted him from speaking. Bakugo pushed him onto the couch roughly and shoved the container he carried into his hands, revealing a small stack of sweet buns. Eat, Bakugo grumbled before leaning against the side of the couch to watch expectantly. On his other side, Todoroki munched his own bun, a savory smell coming from it rather than sweet, settling down on the cushion to knock Izuku's leg absently. So, I see the quirk hasn't lessened at all, Aizawa said with a raised brow. I was a little worried, but I think I actually prefer the three of you getting along. Don't say that, sensei, Izuku sighed, not entirely sure he was joking. Obediently, he took a bite when Bakugo started tapping his fingers impatiently. It was absolutely delicious. Izuku was starting to sense a theme. Swallowing, he said, I actually wanted to talk to you about the quirk before class today. Is it possible to contact the one who did it? Aizawa didn't answer for a moment, watching the three of them critically. That might be difficult. The one responsible is Shino Katie, a student of the quirk special needs course at Masagaki Elementary. It might take a while to arrange a meeting as her parents will have to be present, as well as her teacher. Is there a specific problem that can't be solved amongst you? Izuku frowned. He was hoping for something as soon as today, but that didn't sound like it was possible. Why all the trouble? You had no problem letting the lot of those brats loose on us at training, Bakugo said with a scowl. There were several pro-heroes as well as teachers present, and each child had to have signed permission to participate from a parent or guardian, Aizawa drawled, unaffected. Now I ask again, is there a specific problem that you cannot solve on your own? No, Izuku said slowly, thinking of everything that had happened so far. He believed that as long as he kept himself in check, he should be able to handle this. But I would still like to have a comprehensive list of symptoms for the quirk so that I know better what to expect. Aizawa's eyes sharpened, the first inkling of alarm making it through his calm demeanor, arms falling out of their lackadaisical cross. Symptoms? What kind of symptoms? Oi! You can stop talking about us like we aren't even here, Bakugo snapped, interrupting the conversation handily. Ignoring Bakugo as easily as he always did, Aizawa said succinctly, according to the official profile, the only effect of Shino-san's quirk should be a temporary increase in affectionate behavior toward the last person in the subject's mind before activation. There is a slight sensitivity of the object of affection's emotions, but no other effects. It lasts 7 days, give or take. Izuku frowned, thinking that over. That might explain why they fixated on him, although it was a little weird that they were thinking about him at the same time. If that was all there was to the quirk, then it was no wonder why Aizawa hadn't seemed particularly concerned. The only problem with that was, that's slight, Bakugo said incredulously. If Deku's mood swings were any louder, I'd be deaf. I don't think, Todoroki added with a small wrinkle between his brows, that's all there is to it. Oh, explain, Aizawa said with a little more severity. Todoroki looked at a loss, working his jaw as he thought through what he was trying to say. Bakugo similarly looked constipated. Izuku's brows drew together. They can feel my emotions, true. But they also seem compelled to follow my whims. Like. Deku can influence us, Bakugo said, unexpectedly flat. Though it's got limits. Todoroki hummed in agreement, sounding unbothered for all Izuku's stomach dropped right through the floor. You seem to be taking this rather well, Aizawa pointed out, narrowing his bloodshot eyes at Bakugo. Also, I don't think I've ever seen you this cooperative. Bakugo shrugged. Until this quirk is gone, Deku won't believe me when I tell him I love him. So it's gotta go. Izuku made a small, dismayed noise, but Aizawa just nodded thoughtfully. What else? It was Todoroki who answered this time. I've been experiencing memory gaps. Specifically from my childhood. He raised a hand to his scar, worrying the edge. When Aizawa looked at Bakugo he confirmed with a terse nod, defensive grimace firmly in place. Understood, Aizawa said, straightening and turning toward the door. I will get in contact with Miss Shino and her family and confirm a few things. In the meantime, the three of you are forbidden from sparring. If you need further accommodation for the time being, please inform Recovery Girl. Also, I apologize. He looked at Izuku, nodding solemnly. I should not have taken the child's quirk profile at face value. Her abilities are still developing and there is a very real possibility that the information is out of date. He scanned the three of them one more time before walking to the door. Get to class. I'll have more information for you this evening if we're lucky. The silence was thick the moment the door closed behind him and Izuku gulped, thinking hard. TCH, Bakugo scoffed. There's no way this happened just because we had a stray thought about Deku when we were in the middle of a fight. It seems unlikely, Todoroki agreed. What were you thinking about? Izuku asked cautiously. Todoroki's brows drew together. I think it was something like, how would Midoriya reach these kids? That actually made a lot of sense. Izuku thought constantly how other heroes with different quirks he'd observed and methods he admired would handle each situation. He had dozens and dozens of notebooks dedicated to it. But Bakugo, the prideful explosion hero who did things his own way no matter what. What had he been thinking about? Izuku looked at Bakugo expectantly, only to receive a little shock to find the boy blushing. Kacchan. Bakugo muttered something under his breath, crossing his arms petulantly across his chest. Izuku stared intently. He didn't actually know what he wanted Bakugo to say, but he knew that he did want an answer. Bakugo glared right back before planting a palm in Izuku's face, forcing it away. Cut it out, I got it already. I was thinking something similar. About how you were good with kids. Izuku perked up, grabbing Bakugo's hand and giving him a brilliant smile. You were thinking nice thoughts about me before the quirk. Bakugo stuttered, eyes widening in defensive anger. I think nice thoughts about you all the time. A chin plopped down on Izuku's shoulder, a curious Todoroki peering up at the flustered blonde. He does, even if it comes out as complaining on the outside. Izuku blinked rapidly, face hot and feeling a bit pinned between them. Until he realized that he was the one holding Bakugo's hand and the boy had made no move to take it back, despite the look on his face suggesting he'd rather be anywhere else. Ah ha ha, Izuku said, dropping the hand and turning so Todoroki had to sit up. So you guys are fully aware of what's going on now. Bakugo stared at his hand for a moment before grumbling, we aren't idiots. Why the hell else would we suddenly overcome our bullshit and ask you out? You didn't seem to think so yesterday, Izuku pointed out, privately doubting that they were fully aware, even though they seemed to think so. Getting over their bullshit made it sound like they actually liked him like that, and he highly doubted that was the case. Bakugo rolled his eyes. I stand by what I said yesterday. No quirk can make me do something I don't want to. Stop looking at me like that shitty Deku, I'm serious. Right, Izuku agreed, if only to calm him down. It wasn't entirely successful, Bakugo audibly grinding his teeth in frustration, but he needed to move on. You said something about memory loss, Izuku turned to address Todoroki. Todoroki nodded. There was always something holding me back from getting close to others, but I can't remember what it was. Also, he lightly touched his scar. I think it has something to do with this. I don't know how I got it. You don't remember something so important, Izuku said, utterly shocked. He turned abruptly on Bakugo, who looked equally disturbed. What about you? What don't you remember? Bakugo looked at him like he was nuts. How am I supposed to know? I don't have any physical marks I don't remember getting, idiot. Ignoring the insult, Izuku placed a hand over his mouth, thinking hard. So not only are inhibitions lifted, but inhibitions driven by specific memories that may have been traumatic. Is that why there is such a stark difference in patterns of behavior? The memories could be holding them back from doing more than the one thing that the quirk compels, thus freeing them to do things they would have otherwise done had the events never happened, like Kacchan's cooking or Todoroki's physical affection. I wonder, he muttered, sinking further into the couch. Bakugo sighed loudly. Ugh, I hate it when he does this, he grumbled, grabbing the container off Izuku's fidgeting knee that was about to tip his breakfast onto the floor. I think it's cute, Todoroki said without shame, and Bakugo shot him a look. It's not cute when it distracts him from taking care of himself. I've seen this idiot go off on tangents for hours. Bakugo glared at the clock before taking one of the buns and shoving it into a distracted Izuku's face. Without pausing, Izuku began munching on it, eyes still distant and muttering muffled. Come on, Einstein, we have to get to class. He tugged the boy to his feet. There was an overwhelming urge to leave Izuku to his thoughts and not distract him, but Bakugo shook it off with a huff of annoyance. Yeah, I hear you. But now isn't the time to check out, nerd. Todoroki wavered where he stood. Maybe we should leave him. Ignore it, candy cane. Class, now. But, Todoroki hesitated. Bakugo growled. Look, giving into his selfish whims isn't what he needs. Tell me which feeling is worse, ignoring his stupid desires of the moment or having him feel all guilty later when he realizes. Good point, Todoroki nodded after some consideration. Sidling around Izuku ignoring his emotions really was uncomfortable, so he would try to be as least distracting as possible. He walked to Bakugo's other side to fulfill one of his own urges. He grabbed Bakugo's hand and leaned into his shoulder, absorbing his warmth. Bakugo blinked at him, surprised, but didn't pull away as he tugged both boys out the door. Seriously, when did it start feeling like he was taking care of two baby chicks? Still, he couldn't deny the small smile that twitched the corner of his lips, and he did nothing to hide it all the way to the school building. The day dragged on and on to Shoto, who couldn't be bothered to pay attention to the droning of their math teacher. There was once a time when he thought it was cool to be taught something as mundane as algebra by a pro hero, but it quickly lost its luster when he realized that math was still math, no matter who taught it. And Shoto hated math. He really wanted to rest his head on the desk and maybe catch a nap, and he couldn't seem to stop fidgeting. This wasn't like him. Usually he would at least pretend to listen. But he couldn't remember why, especially when he was so much more advanced in his studies than his peers because of all the tutoring he had as a kid. Even if those memories were a bit fuzzy now, he could still do every problem the teacher presented with ease. He looked out the window into the sky, the breeze swaying the trees every once in a while. When he grew bored of that, he glanced over at Midorya, smiling in amusement when he saw the boy intently scribbling into his notebook, as into the lessons as ever. A well of warmth engulfed Shoto and his smile widened, eyes softening. This was something he was familiar with, although lately the warmth was so much more intense. He could feel how invested Midorya was with what the teacher was saying and he couldn't help but find it mesmerizing. An itch started beneath his skin and he shifted, hugging himself, eyes drifting to the ceiling. Lately, he just couldn't seem to get enough contact. Touching others, touching himself. Not in any inappropriate way, though he got the feeling that any touch had been inappropriate to him before all this. Why was a mystery, but he found the itch incredibly distracting now. He rubbed his arms, rubbed the back of his neck, but nothing seemed to work. It just made him feel lonely. Loneliness was an old, tired companion of his, one he wished more than anything to be rid of. Especially now that he knew what it was like to be free of it, if only for a little while. He tried to push the insistent feeling down, but it was difficult. Throughout this entire ordeal, he'd either been with Bakugo or Midorya, so it wasn't so bad. He hadn't even really noticed it, because there was always someone with him that he could touch. But in the classroom, with the desks in rows and the other students so far away from each other, since when had he thought a few feet was far? Anyway, he couldn't get what he craved. "Todoroki-san, are you quite all right?" Ectoplasm inquired from his place by the blackboard. Shoto jolted, realizing that all eyes in the class were on him. He stilled his hands, which had been rubbing over his chest without his notice, a slight, bewildered flush making its way up his neck. I don't know," he said honestly. He glanced uncertainly at Bakugo to find the blonde boy watching him intently, eyes narrowed. A surge of worry roiled heavily in Shoto's gut and he found his eyes pulled inexorably to Midorya, who was watching him just as intently. It made his skin itch worse, but he had no idea what to do about it. "Are you feeling unwell? I understand that you've been affected by a quirk. If you need to leave to see Recovery Girl, you may do so," Ectoplasm said kindly. Shoto shivered. "I think I will. Thank you, sir." He was out the door and down the hall before he quite knew what he was doing. He breathed a little easier when he couldn't feel the other's eyes on him any longer. But he felt alarmed and worried beneath all the confusion. He gasped as the feeling grew worse, an almost overwhelming urge to go back and soothe it warring with his desire to escape. He swayed and fell against the wall, conflicted, and realized slowly that he must be feeling Midorya again. He wanted to go back and press as much of himself onto Midorya as he could, to soothe the itch in his own skin, to soothe Midoriya's fretting. He also wanted to run away as far as his legs could take him, to huddle into himself and hide. His head split with a sudden headache as he fought with himself. He felt nauseous. The walls swayed. Todoroki gasped as his hand was grabbed abruptly and he was tugged into a firm chest, Bakugo's scent enveloping him with familiar safety. Shoto immediately melted into his embrace, holding him back just as fiercely and feeling some of his discomfort recede. Bakugo. Come on. We need to get out of here, Bakugo said with a strained voice, letting go of Shoto only to drag him down the hall as fast as he could pull the stumbling boy. Bakugo cursed under his breath repeatedly while Shoto watched his tense shoulders, bemused. Bakugo kicked the door open viciously and suddenly they were outside. He didn't stop there, dragging Shoto to the tree line surrounding the training area. With every step they took, Shoto could feel the tight anxiety in his chest loosening, the crowding in his lungs fading away the further they got from the school building. The further they got from Midorya. Bakugo, wait, Shoto gasped, out of breath, but Bakugo didn't slow, not until they reached the perimeter of the grounds. Get us over this wall. Shoto drew his brows together, but complied, lifting them from the ground with a column of ice and creating a staircase down the backside. Bakugo was moving again, tugging him deeper into the forest. Shoto stumbled, but a second later stopped resisting, falling into step at Bakugo's side, their hands held tightly between them. He watched the other boy curiously, how his brow relaxed further with every step they took, and just took comfort in the clasp of their hands. Eventually, Bakugo stopped, taking a deep breath of the clean air and letting his shoulders relax. Bakugo breathed. That beeped. You going to tell me what the hell that was all about in class? He peered at Shoto with one crimson eye, expectant. He wanted to know what Shoto's deal was. After he pulled him all the way out here like a crazy person. You first. Bakugo scowled. It was hard to concentrate with Deku's stupid mood swings. Besides, you needed me more. Shoto paused. I did. Bakugo peered at him, incredulous. Are you really that thick? You looked like you were about to pass the out. He shouted, hackles raising. Shoto thought back, trying to figure out what he had been feeling. What he was still feeling. Suddenly he knew exactly what he wanted. Grasping Bakugo's hand tightly, he sat down with his back against a tree, tugging Bakugo into his lap and holding him close. Bakugo squirmed, looking down at Shoto like he'd lost his mind. What are you doing? Hugging you, Shoto said bluntly, nuzzling into Bakugo's neck. He sighed as his feverish skin was soothed, an ache he didn't know he was carrying falling away. With a grumble, Bakugo relaxed, patting Shoto's shoulder as he would a needy pet. What, are you horny or something? He said with the barest hint of humor. Was he? Shoto couldn't really tell if that was the problem. He hadn't ever felt anything like arousal or desire before Bakugo beeped him the first time, and it didn't really feel like that. He really just wanted to be held. Why? Shoto thought, frowning into Bakugo's skin. Why had he never done this before? It felt so nice, but he was no closer to an answer than he'd been the day before. What the hell? You're a lot clingier than usual, Bakugo commented, plopping his chin on top of Shoto's bowed head, letting his arms hang loose over his shoulders. And you're a lot more docile than usual, Shoto replied dryly. Shut up, Bakugo muttered, but it was without heat. They sat like that for a long while, just relaxing beneath the shadow of the trees as Shoto allowed himself to calm and his thoughts to wander. I'm harsh with you because you are bet. Ignore them, son. They are beneath. My dad says your dad says I'm not supposed to play with yo. Disgusting. You look like him. Shoto jumped slightly, eyes he hadn't known he'd closed snapping open. Then he relaxed, mind muddled as the sense of alarm faded away. At his movement, Bakugo huffed, squirming slightly in his seat. Shoto blinked. Was that? Now who's the horny one? Shoto said with some surprise, pulling Bakugo flush and feeling the distinct pressure of his arousal against his belly. Bakugo twitched before pulling back abruptly, snatching Shoto's hair and yanking until they were eye to eye, glaring fiercely. I thought I told you to shut up, Bakugo husked before pressing his lips to Shoto's with more bite than tenderness. He pulled back before Shoto could properly respond, scowling. What do you expect? Rubbing all up against me like that, idiot? Was Bakugo being bashful? Shoto's lips twitched and Bakugo growled. Stop laughing at me, damn it. I'm not. Shoto held back the mirth he could feel at the back of his throat. He cleared it, looking away. Midorya's probably worried still. Shouldn't we get back? He said, teasing. HMPH. Deku's always worried. Let him stew. Bakugo growled, dragging his fingers up Shoto's back and into his hair. Shoto shivered, mouth falling open slightly. Taking immediate advantage, Bakugo pressed their lips together again, this time more gently, insistently. He slipped his tongue inside and Shoto twitched, feeling himself respond with little jolts of electricity down his sides. Bakugo pressed down into him and Shoto sighed, clutching him closer and rolling his hips. It was Bakugo's turn to laugh. Needy, he husked, and Shoto couldn't disagree. He felt needy, like he couldn't quite get close enough, like he wanted to crawl into the other boy's skin. But since that was impossible, he rolled his hips again, swallowing Bakugo's growl. Abruptly, Bakugo pulled away, shuffling out of Shoto's grip and leaning back. Dismayed, Shoto reached for him again, but Bakugo grinned, dodging him. Hold still, half in half, he said lowly, grin sharp and dangerous. Shoto did as he was told, watching numbly as Bakugo went for his fly, tugging and manipulating until Shoto's lower half was exposed to the warm air, his knee bobbing free to rest against his hip. He allowed himself to be dragged down until he was in a half recline, holding the tree behind him for stability. He didn't feel an ounce of discomfort as Bakugo perused him with covetous eyes, meeting the ever-present challenge in his gaze as if they stood on the opposite ends of a training field. It always felt a bit like that, just as exciting, just as fun. Even Shoto thought it was odd that he felt this way, especially since the first time it happened he'd been so angry. But, well, it was hard to hold on to anger when your rival was going down on you. Bakugo glanced at his focused expression with clear amusement before laying down on his stomach, wrapping his arms around Shoto's hips and pulling him closer. Shoto threw his head back with a loud gasp at the first wash of wet heat dragging along the underside of his flushed cock, shivering as Bakugo's warm breath engulfed him. It was a familiar cacophony of signals that Shoto still wasn't used to, no matter how many times it happened, how many times they'd done this, making him ache and burn in ways he'd never known before. Shoto reached down with shaking hands to touch as much as the other boy as he could reach, running his fingers through his hair, stroking his jaw, his neck, as Bakugo took him slowly inside, humming around his length while Shoto fought to keep himself still, to not give in to the sharp urging of his blood to take. Shoto's lashes fluttered as Bakugo pressed him in deeper with a voracious greed only Bakugo seemed capable, bobbing his head, beeping lightly before swirling his tongue around Shoto's sensitive crown, never taking his piercing eyes off Shoto's increasingly wrecked face. All of that incredible, singular focus was on the task at hand, on Shoto, and every soul-shattering suction, every scrape of teeth and smug smirk felt like acclaiming, as if Shoto was exactly where Bakugo wanted him and would be until he deigned to release him. It burned Shoto in more ways than one: helpless arousal, greed to match Bakugo's own, and an irresistible urge to meet his challenge and come out on top, all things that he'd never felt so fiercely before meeting this intense boy. Before meeting Midorya, Shoto gasped, eyes widening as he nearly finished right then and there, remembering with a sharp ache how it had felt to beat Midorya, to hold his broad, impossibly strong shoulders in his arms and hear the other boy call his name in that breathless staccato. A trembling hand slapped over Shoto's mouth, holding back a whimper as his entire body flushed harshly, nearly pushing him over the edge. Bakugo hummed, pulling off, a thin string of precum and saliva connecting him to Shoto's cock. He licked his lips, breaking it and giving Shoto a salacious grin, and Shoto felt another molten jolt. What did you just think about? Shoto stared blankly, scanning the flush along Bakugo's tan cheeks and the wet gleam of his lips. Midorya, when I beeped him. Bakugo's pupils widened, his grin sharpening. Yeah, that was hot, he said without hesitation. He crawled up Shoto's body to straddle his hips, one hand planted against the tree above Shoto's head with a dull slap that Shoto felt in his bones. He shivered, staring up into Bakugo's smug, crimson eyes. How did he taste? Bakugo whispered. Like mouth. Shoto said without thinking, distracted. What kind of question was that? When Bakugo's smile dissolved, Shoto elaborated, brain struggling to keep up without vital blood flow. Kind of sweet, because he'd been eating pancakes. But Shoto wasn't sure why that would be relevant when Shoto was so close to orgasm he could see spots flashing before his eyes. Why did Bakugo stop? To Shoto's bewilderment, Bakugo slumped into his shoulder with a pained groan. What had he said? Why'd I even bother? Bakugo disparaged, and now Shoto was offended. You're not making sense, he muttered, looking away. Bakugo said abruptly, sitting back and pulling down his own fly. Just sit there and look pretty, clueless idiot. Shoto scowled, bucking his hips and flipping them over, a surprised Bakugo pinned beneath him. Just how many times was he going to be called an idiot today? Who would? He slapped Bakugo's hands away and pulled the heavy length of him out himself, pressing his hips down aggressively and wrapping his fingers around them both. Bakugo hissed, amusement dancing in his eyes even as he arched. Oh yeah, and what are you going to do about it? He taunted, folding his hands behind his head, unimpressed. Shoto grit his teeth, determined to wipe that smile right off his arrogant face. He heated up his hand ever so slightly and was gratified to see Bakugo's eyes widen in genuine shock. Oh, phew, Shoto bit at his lips, heated his hand up further until it was almost unbearable, and began to move, gasping into Bakugo's mouth. Just lay back and look pretty, he threw back, grinding his hips down with a loopy grin he just couldn't help. His cock was damp from Bakugo's attentions and it slid over the velvet length in his grip perfectly. Shoto couldn't help the stutter in his breath or the arrhythmic pumping of his hips, nor did he remotely desire to, chasing after his own end just as much as he chased the covetous moment of his rival's faltering pride. Bakugo's expression hazed over as he grasped tightly to Shoto's shoulders, arching beneath him, aborted curses spilling from slack lips. Satisfaction licked Shoto's insides to watch him come apart, heat unrelated to his quirk building and building inside until it was almost too much. He rarely saw this side of Bakugo and it tickled his ego to see it each and every time, because he was the cause. Bakugo liked it when he showed his strength. It was part of why Shoto had thought that was the only reason Bakugo continued to come to him, because Shoto was one of the very few people who could. Probably because Bakugo let him. In hindsight, maybe he really was an idiot. I bet Midorya could hold you down like this, Shoto gasped into Bakugo's ear, and Bakugo bucked, groaning beautifully. But Shoto's words had a greater effect on himself than he'd anticipated as the fantasy he'd evoked flashed brightly in his mind. Midorya holding Bakugo down just like Shoto was now, his face twisted in shy pleasure while Bakugo writhed beneath him, teeth bared like a wild animal, all contained power behind the veneer of submission. Shoto came with a low groan, shaking apart above Bakugo as he coated them both with white, his hand slowing as he came down. Don't you dare. Bakugo pushed his soiled hand out of the way and replaced it with his own, speeding back up. Shoto cringed, gasping with oversensitivity. His arms felt like jello as he collapsed, face pressing into Bakugo's working shoulder helplessly. He wanted to get closer, he wanted to get away. Bakugo growled, his whole body jerking. Suddenly, he grasped Shoto's hair harshly and pushed him into his shoulder. Bite, he demanded, and Shoto did without question, sinking his teeth into the meat of Bakugo's shoulder until he tasted iron. Bakugo seized and came with a shouted curse, his voice breaking off the trees. He wrapped his legs around Shoto's hips and held him down as he twitched through the aftershocks, both boys panting as if they'd gone several rounds in the ring. Finally, he relaxed, Shoto releasing his jaw to place a beep over the bruise already forming on Bakugo's skin. Bakugo twitched and huffed a laugh. When the air became too suffocating between them to tolerate any longer, Shoto managed to push himself up, staring down dazedly. He eyed the complete mess that was Bakugo, all flushed skin and satisfied smirks. Then he caught sight of the mark on his shoulder, already turning purple in the speckled light, flecks of blood drying where he'd broken skin. Sorry, Shoto trailed off, a little pang of regret dampening his mood. He hadn't meant to hurt him. Bakugo scowled, rolling his eyes. With his clean hand, he pushed Shoto off of him unceremoniously, getting to his feet. I asked for it, didn't I? So don't apologize. Tucking himself away and straightening his grass-stained clothes, he looked over his shoulder at a stunned Shoto and gave him a once-over, smugness rolling off of him in waves. You feeling better now? Shoto nodded slowly. He did feel better, though he wasn't sure if it was because of the hug or that had somehow become so casual an experience between them. He decided it was probably both. The discomfort that had been bothering him faded into a dull buzz in the background. Yeah, he got to his feet as well, straightening himself as the two of them made their way back to the school. Shoto eyed Bakugo from the corner of his eye, noting that the bite mark was barely visible beneath his collar. They'd never done something like that before. He wasn't sure how he felt about it but decided to put it aside for now. It wasn't like he knew anything about that Bakugo hadn't taught him himself. Maybe that was a normal thing to do. He would look it up later. That was something Bakugo had been insisting he do lately anyway, even if he still felt vaguely that he wasn't supposed to. I feel disgusting. Let's skip and hit the showers. Shoto hummed in agreement. He did feel sticky. Class. You heard Sleeping Beauty. We have permission to off if we need to. Shoto made a face, fairly certain that Aizawa didn't mean it quite like this. But he shrugged a second later, deciding he didn't really care. By the time they'd cleaned up and hung around for a while, classes were already over. Shoto drifted in and out of a light snooze, a languid Bakugo his reluctant pillow, the latter propped up and reading a book over Shoto's head. It was remarkably peaceful considering Bakugo would usually have pushed him off a long time ago. In fact, this was the longest continuous contact they'd had, the other usually reaching his threshold for mushy crap long before Shoto did. It was really nice and Shoto almost thought he could fall asleep just like this. Only for a dash of anxiety to ruin his tranquility. He frowned, burying his face into Bakugo's chest, but the feeling only grew worse. A moment later showed why. For s sake, Bakugo sighed, snapping his book closed just as Midorya burst through the door, looking around frantically. He spotted them immediately, rushing over to the couch in alarm, the others probably heading to the cafeteria for dinner or just walking at a more sedate pace. Before the distraught boy could say anything, Bakugo cut him off. About time. He sat up, lifting a groggy Shoto with him. Shimmying out from beneath Shoto, he dragged a startled Midorya to the couch in his place. Hold this touch-starved cat, would you? I'm hungry. Wah. Midorya stuttered, flushed and confused, but he didn't get a chance to finish his question before Bakugo planted a beep on his forehead and sauntered off to the kitchen with a dismissive wave. Feeling agitated, Shoto flopped onto a gobsmacked Midorya's lap, the boy startling from his dazed stare. Todoroki, are you all right? You left class so suddenly. I'm okay, Shoto said. I just wanted to cuddle. Wait, that was why you left. Midorya was relaxing, finally, and Shoto settled more comfortably. Yeah, I was feeling kind of anxious since you guys weren't touching me, he said frankly. Touch-starved. Midoriya's voice was quiet, thoughtful, and he started stroking Shoto's hair, much to his delight. Shoto felt a flash of anger and he flinched, lurching up abruptly. But Midorya scrambled, immediately apologetic. Sorry, I didn't mean. You can lay back down. I was just a little sad thinking about why you must feel this way. Why? Shoto trailed off. He was curious himself. I don't remember. He looked into Midoriya's darkening expression. You're angry. Not at you, Midorya mumbled, coaxing Shoto lightly until he was prone again and rubbing his back soothingly. Okay, Shoto said, closing his eyes and breathing in Midoriya's scent. He didn't really get it, but he wasn't going to complain as long as it wasn't directed towards him. The chatter of voices intruded on the quiet, some of the others returning. Midorya didn't pull away, so Shoto didn't move either. Hey, Todoroki, are you feeling better? Kirishima called with a friendly smile. He sat on the opposite couch, Kaminari sitting at his side, the energetic blonde practically bouncing in place. Yeah, you just up and left. Did you get a rash or something? No, Shoto said, raising a brow. He was feeling lonely, obviously, Mina interrupted, mussing Kaminari's hair roughly. Hey, not the hair, that's what you get for being nosy. You're one to talk, Kirishima said mildly, and got a pout in return. To Shoto and Midoriya, he said, I'm glad you guys are feeling better. Maybe you should sit a little closer to each other in class for now, at least until this wears off. I dunno, Midoriya said, and Shoto could practically hear the blush rising on his face along with a heady dose of embarrassment. This time Shoto didn't defend him, though. He was getting a little better at resisting the discomfort now that he knew what it was. Yeah, Shoto said, liking the idea. For some reason, Mina squealed and Kaminari burst out into laughter, only to be shushed by a long-suffering Kirishima. What is that smell? Mina said, instantly distracted. It's amazing. I think Kacchan is cooking something again, Midoriya said, relieved to not be the center of attention. And that was all it took for Bakugo's friends to exchange excited glances and head for the kitchen. Moments later Bakugo's irate yelling could be heard, and Midoriya huffed a laugh, his amusement making Shoto smile. Those guys never change. Yeah, Bakugo is lucky to have them. Leaning over until he could look Shoto in the eye, Midoriya said seriously, Todoroki. They're your friends too. Were they? Shoto didn't know about that. But the look in Midoriya's eyes begged him to agree, so he did with a non-committal nod, even if he didn't really believe it. When are you going to call me Shoto? He said instead of answering seriously. Please, I've wanted to ask you to for a long time, before any of this. It took a while for Midoriya to answer, and even with his new sensitivity, Shoto couldn't really tell what he was feeling. Normally he wouldn't push, but it was just, he felt left out, he supposed. Bakugo and Midoriya had their pet names for each other. Well, Bakugo called everyone by another name, usually an insult of some sort. But he called Midoriya Izuku, that one time, though, so he must be special. It made Shoto a little jealous, if he was being honest. He'd never had anyone outside of his family call him Shoto, and he didn't even get to see them that often. Do you promise? Midoriya said seriously, and Shoto shifted, unsure what he meant. Promise what? That you wanted me to call you Shoto before the quirk. Oh, yeah, he said with a small shiver, liking the sound of his name on Midoriya's lips, because he had wanted it for a long time. He'd never had a friend quite like Midoriya, though friendship wasn't exactly what he wanted anymore. Really, you won't feel differently later. I promise, Shoto said easily, unable to imagine a world where he didn't want to be close to Midoriya. What a silly thought. Midoriya's face cleared with a kind smile, though Shoto couldn't really tell if he felt reassured or not. Okay, then, Shoto. And you can call me Izuku if you want. Shoto lifted himself onto his knees so he could look Midoriya Izuku properly in the face. Izuku, he said softly, leaning closer. Izuku's eyes widened, but he didn't stop Shoto as he lifted a hand to caress his cheek, leaning in. PDA, someone called teasingly, and the two jerked apart, startled. They'd been too wrapped up in their conversation to notice the other's return, though most of them weren't paying them any attention, already used to their behavior. Get a room if you're going to make out. Leave them alone, Shiro, Uraraka called brightly, strolling through the door with Tsuyu and Iida at her heels. Iida didn't look as pleased. Do not get a room if you're going to engage in such inappropriate behavior. I'd much rather have you in a public area where you can be supervised. Izuku groaned, clearly mortified. Ada, we aren't doing anything. Iida raised both brows, gesturing wildly between them as if to say, I'll believe it when I see it. In any case, you shouldn't have run off like that, Midoriya. Aizawa-sensei was looking for you. Really? Izuku jumped to his feet as if he was going to run after the teacher this very second, but Uraraka stopped him with a bubbly laugh. It's too late now, silly. He's already left campus, which you'd know if you hadn't run from class like a bat out of hell. She settled down on the couch opposite them, Tsuyu sitting at her side. He told us to tell you that he was visiting someone and that he'd be back in the morning, Hiro, Tsuyu said in that peculiarly calm way of hers. Oh, Izuku said, disappointed. All right then, we'll be fine, Shoto reassured, slumping into his side, and was gratified that Izuku eased at his words, if only a little. Iida looked like he was going to protest again, but Uraraka waved him off, much to Shoto's relief. It wasn't like he was going to listen if he told them to keep a proper 3-foot distance from each other, but his nagging was starting to wear on Shoto anyway. Well, I heard you guys are forbidden from sparring, so let's play a game instead. I asked my mom to send us some games and they just arrived today, Uraraka said cheerfully. After that, the evening went relatively normally. Only, today was special. Shoto could feel it. It was like he'd made a breakthrough of some sort, though he wasn't entirely sure what it was, just that he felt more connected with everyone, he guessed. It wasn't even that he was doing anything particularly differently, aside from leaning against Izuku, but it was like this invisible wall that had always been between him and everyone else had been knocked down. He even started to think that maybe Izuku had been onto something. Maybe everyone was already Shoto's friend, but he just hadn't noticed. When Bakugo emerged from the kitchen carrying way too many baked goods for everyone to share, complaining all the while that he didn't want their praise, damn it, he'd just made too much, and Shoto found himself laughing easily while everyone either watched or destroyed each other at Uno, he felt a peace growing in him he'd never known before. He realized after a while longer that he felt happy. Genuinely, freely happy. He hoped this peace could last forever. I'm sorry to say this, Mr. Eraserhead, Mrs. Shino fretted, nervously patting her young daughter's braids, though the child looked rather bored with the proceedings. But Katie's quirk doesn't work like that. It's as her records say, and there hasn't been much change since they manifested when she was 4. I'm not sure about these other symptoms, but they aren't Katie's doing, I assure you. That's what I said, Katie complained, stomping her foot. Stupid adults never listen. Katie, her mother scolded, but the child slipped from under her hand, racing out the door with a rebellious HMPH. Mrs. Shino sighed. I'm sorry about her. She's actually a lot better since her session with your students. Will there be more of those in the future? She asked hopefully. Perhaps, Aizawa mumbled, distracted. This was just great. If Katie hadn't been responsible for his student's predicament, then who had? Aizawa said his goodbyes and made his way slowly to the bus stop. He had a bad feeling. He just hoped he was wrong. With a put-upon sigh and already regretting this rash decision, he pulled out his cell and dialed a number he'd promised himself he would never use. Hey, it's me, he drawled, and winced as a shriek and loud chatter assaulted his ear. No, I'm not calling to ask you on a date. Listen, have your students been behaving strangely since Saturday's remedial session? Chapter text. Despite Izuku's hopes, Aizawa had not returned the next day. It was really starting to stress him out. It was a shame too, because Izuku had woken that morning feeling more rested than he had in a long time. For once, he didn't remember what he'd dreamed about, just felt the lingering warmth in his chest and a general sense of well-being. He'd half expected, when he'd opened his eyes, to find Bakugo and Todoroki at his sides as he had imagined the night before, but besides their lingering sense, he found his sheets cold and empty. They hadn't come back to his room outside of his dreams since he'd thrown them out. He still didn't know how he felt about that. Like the previous day, Todoroki picked Izuku up from his room, Bakugo threatened him into eating something delicious, and they'd gone to class together. Izuku came to the startling realization, after swallowing down the last tasty morsel and finally wiping the sleep from his eyes, that he was becoming used to this, the fussing, the affection, the closeness. It was dangerous, but he couldn't help the way his heart swayed despite all odds. He had to remain strong. But he could be honest with himself in one thing: he would absolutely miss this when it was gone. There was one marked difference today that wasn't the case before. Todoroki now sat with his desk shoved flush to Izuku's and refused to leave his side. He might have been a little uncomfortable with that, but Todoroki stared at Bakugo until he too did the same, pushing his desk to Todoroki's other side. The blonde muttered about it, but didn't complain outright, especially when Todoroki gave him that tiny, barely there smile that seemed to melt Bakugo just as easily as it did Izuku. Todoroki looked pleased, the boy leaning against Izuku's shoulder and his feet tangled with Bakugo's on the other. Bakugo ignored him. The rest of Class 1A barely paid attention other than a few snickers. They didn't even get a lifted brow from Midnight, who was filling in for Aizawa. Even Iida looked resigned at this point. Izuku gave up, leaning into Todoroki as well and deciding to just enjoy it while it lasted. It's not like he could bring himself to particularly mind, and could only hope that Todoroki was getting as much out of their closeness as Izuku was. After yesterday's suspicions, Izuku could hardly blame the boy for wanting as much physical touch as he was allowed without his memories to bog him down. Izuku didn't want to think about what those memories could contain. Todoroki said he didn't remember how he got his scar. Was the experience so terrible that it would drive him away from the physical touch he craved? It made Izuku antsy to think about, an unfocused energy that buzzed in his shoulders, urging him to do something, though he couldn't fathom what that could be. Go confront Endeavor. The thought alone evoked the simultaneous urges to break something, preferably Endeavor's nose, and shit his pants because mere students didn't challenge the #1 hero. Besides, he wasn't certain that Endeavor was the one responsible. If he had been, wouldn't someone have done something about it by now? Izuku only had to remember the intense bullying he'd been on the bad end of as a child, the complete willful ignorance of the adults around him, to realize what an absurd thought that was. Back then, even if Izuku had been brave enough to shout his pain from the rooftops, he doubted that the adults at his school or otherwise would have done anything about it. He didn't want to think badly about the teachers at UA, but somehow he couldn't see them doing anything about the current #1 hero, even if he had been laying his hands on his youngest son. But All Might wasn't like that. Toshinori listened when Izuku told him his fears. He never dismissed him, never ignored Izuku like everyone else. It still made Izuku giddy inside to remember how Toshinori had promised to raise Izuku that day on the beach when everything had seemed so grim. He worried about Izuku, but didn't hold him back like his fretful mother. He listened to Izuku and gave advice when he was struggling, even if he didn't always have all the answers. Even if Toshinori had more pressures and problems than any sane man should have to carry, he was always there. He was what a father should be. Maybe he could tell Toshinori about this and he could help Izuku help Todoroki. Izuku leaned into the warmth of Todoroki at his side and couldn't imagine anyone ever harming someone so deserving of love. But if he'd learned anything in his short time trying to become a hero, there were so many people out there who could, and would, bring him harm. He got that. The only problem was, they were villains. It made sense for them to want to hurt, it was what they did. But Todoroki should never, ever have feared someone who should by all rights have loved him. Which brought to mind another unsettling matter. Kacchan. He'd been completely different towards Izuku since the love quirk took hold, and it had been bothering Izuku more and more as time passed. It wasn't as if his personality had changed, per se. He was still the same prickly boy Izuku had always known, still competitive to a fault, crass, cantankerous. But no longer did he try to pick serious fights with Izuku, no longer did he call Izuku his worst insults save for the ones that had practically become affectionate nicknames between them, no longer did he look like he wanted to set fire to Izuku's unruly hair every time they locked eyes. He seemed more confident, if that made sense. Which it absolutely shouldn't, because he was Kacchan, the most confident, self-assured person Izuku had ever known. And yet, he now possessed a different kind of confidence, a more quiet one, maybe, that he didn't have to scream from the top of the mountain to be heard because for the first time, he actually believed it. Bakugo believed it, and the fact that he might not have before baffled Izuku. What must he have heard, seen, felt, that would ever make Bakugo believe that he wasn't as capable as he always professed to be? Bakugo said that there were no physical marks on him that he couldn't remember getting. So what had been so traumatic that Bakugo would have forgotten to change him so much? Izuku didn't know anything about Bakugo's home life. Even when they were kids, he'd never been to his house, and other than vague memories of a blonde, angry-looking woman and a quiet, kind-faced man, he didn't remember Bakugo's family. Had they done something so bad that that was the real reason Bakugo had turned away from Izuku when they were kids? Is that why he'd suddenly attacked Izuku? Because he himself had been under attack. Bakugo hated, more than anything in this world, to be called weak. Izuku had been weak, and it was only when he'd realized that he would never have a quirk that the bullying began. A slow realization began to dawn on Izuku. Had Bakugo been projecting? Anger at the thought flashed hot and hard behind Izuku's eyes. Who had told Bakugo that he was weak? Who would dare tell such an incredible person he wasn't good enough, that he would spend every waking moment trying to prove to everyone that he was? So that he couldn't accept help, a compliment, victory unless it was absolute. When Izuku looked up from his desk to look up at Bakugo, he found crimson eyes boring into his own. Izuku's breath caught, pinned beneath that gaze he couldn't escape, as if Bakugo could read his every thought more easily than if he'd written them in a letter and put it in his locker. "Oi!" Midnight called irritably from the front of the class, slapping a stick that Izuku really didn't want to know the purpose of into her perfectly manicured hand. Izuku jolted, shocked and appalled that he'd been caught distracted. Bakugo looked away, releasing Izuku's gaze to kick a snoozing Todoroki. The slumbering boy jerked awake on Izuku's shoulder with a startled snort. "Is my class so unimportant that you three can't pay attention?" "Yes," Bakugo muttered, and Izuku laughed nervously, stuttering the opposite. "Yes," Todoroki agreed, louder, and Midnight's eyes flashed. Unhindered, Todoroki yawned. "I've already memorized this text. However, I apologize for falling asleep. I woke up too early." "Oh," Midnight seethed, a vein pulsing visibly on her pleasantly smiling face. "Well, since the three of you are so far ahead of the rest of the class, why don't you work on finishing all the assignments in the back of the book? Surely you could have that done by tomorrow." Izuku's face drained of all color. All of the assignments. He hadn't been paying attention to the lesson at all, he didn't even know what they were talking about. He gave Todoroki and Bakugo a panicked look, but both of them appeared unbothered. "Fine, hag, we'll do your stupid assignments," Bakugo grunted, getting up from his seat. "Can we go now?" A collective gasp went around the room, Midnight's eyes narrowing with pure ice. The leather of her stick creaked beneath her clenched fists. Bakugo stared her down, unintimidated. Iida was on his feet in an instant, brandishing a rigid hand. "Bakugo, apologize at once." Bakugo didn't even look at him. "Shut it, bowl cut, one said we'd do the assignments, didn't I?" Todoroki got up as well, the both of them grabbing a panicking Izuku's hand and tugging him from his seat. Wait, get out of my class. Don't bother coming back for the rest of the week," Midnight said, and Bakugo muttered something that sounded like ing finally under his breath, dragging Izuku to the door. Izuku was hyperventilating at this point, looking between Midnight, pleadingly at a gobsmacked Iida, and the two boys that held his arms captive. They were being banned from class. For a week. What was happening? "Come on, nerd, there's no way we can concentrate like this, anyway," Bakugo said reasonably. "Dunno why we bothered to show up yesterday." "Damn right," Midnight said, more annoyed than angry if her dismissive brows were anything to go by. She didn't look at them as they headed for the door, much to Izuku's confusion. Besides, this isn't the first time something like this has happened. Love quirks aren't that rare. With the three of you like this, you're just a distraction for everyone else. There were a few hums of agreement and snickers from the rest of the class. Izuku calmed, realizing that yes, he was completely useless at the moment. He didn't even remember anything that they'd gone over the past couple days. With a huff of impatience, Bakugo dragged him from the classroom, slamming the door behind them. "I was serious about the assignments, brat." Midnight's muffled shout came through the door. Yeah, Bakugo shouted back, already halfway down the hall. Izuku groaned. Great, now on top of missing out on lectures and training, he was going to have to do way more busywork than usual. He was really getting sick of this quirk. Although, he hadn't been thinking of all of the heavy stuff that had been plaguing him as much as usual. And it was kind of nice to have the company, even if it was against their will. Maybe Izuku just needed a break. Maybe this could be a blessing. "I can give you the answers," Todoroki offered, nudging Izuku in the side. "That's okay, Shoto." Izuku blushed, especially when Todoroki gave him a small smile, pleased. "I need to catch up anyway." "Don't do it for the nerd, he doesn't need it," Bakugo agreed gruffly, flicking Todoroki's hair aside. "It's his fault for spacing out, anyway." Izuku was a little annoyed by that. "You weren't paying attention either, Kacchan," he scolded, then bit the inside of his lip because Bakugo had probably been distracted by Izuku and his circular thoughts in the first place. The discomfited feeling from earlier began to creep back in, but Izuku suppressed it. Maybe tonight, when he was alone, he'd think about it more. For right now, he didn't want to burden the others with his suspicions, especially when they seemed so happy to be unburdened from their dark memories. So what now? Todoroki wondered, holding out his hand for a passing butterfly. It didn't land, merely hovering over his palm for a few seconds before fluttering away, but Todoroki seemed satisfied anyway. Should we go back to the dorms? It took a few seconds for Bakugo to answer, watching the meandering bug until it was out of sight. Nah, let's spar. Izuku protested immediately. We can't, Kacchan. Aizawa forbid us from training. Besides, we have a lot of work to do now, thanks to someone. Quote. Bakugo scoffed. With the way you blow through homework, you'll have it all done in a couple hours. And what Bandage had said, we can't not train for a week. Icy Hot and I have another remedial course this weekend and we can't afford to fall behind. He's right, Todoroki said mildly. Though, if it makes you feel better, Izuku, we won't use our quirks. That did make Izuku feel better, though it still bothered him a little that they were doing this at all. He couldn't really argue though, not when he felt antsy for staying idle for several days now. His body had recovered and now all he felt was the same nervous energy that had kept him from staying still his entire life. His fingers twitched, body eager even if his mind still held doubts. Bakugo's compulsory che was the only indication that he too agreed before he stalked off toward the smaller gym, Izuku and Todoroki trailing behind him at a much more sedate pace. The gym was older than the other buildings, and a lot smaller. With padded floors and well-used weights, it was more suited for quirkless training than the larger, newer facilities. Another advantage of it was that it had a lot lower traffic. There was no one in it now, Izuku noticed as he walked through the door and inhaled the familiar scents of rubber and iron. Izuku frowned at his uniform. It would have to do. He didn't really feel like going all the way back to the dorms to change. Bakugo had already removed his jacket, shirt and shoes, folding them over a bench press and setting them aside. Which one of you nerds wants to fight me first? The blonde called with a savage grin, and Izuku felt himself respond to the challenge in his voice. This was what Izuku was familiar with, his dark thoughts falling away. Before he knew it, a large grin was growing on his face, heart already racing at the prospect. And maybe it was the look in Bakugo's eyes that did it, challenging yes, but also like nothing Izuku had ever seen. It was softer, less angry, and playful. It reminded him of the time before they had their quirks, when they played together simply because they enjoyed each other's company, without the pressures of a society that only valued the most powerful. Would you like to put him in his place first, or shall I? Todoroki said with fond amusement, gesturing for the mat. Izuku found himself laughing, true and genuine. I don't think Bakugo would accept defeat even if we won. But there's a first time for everything. Why don't you come and prove it then? Before he could take a step onto the floor, Todoroki grabbed his arm, whispering in his ear. I'll be watching. Then he released Izuku, walking to a bench along the side of the room and taking a seat. Flushed and unsure precisely why, Izuku took a deep breath and focused on the matter at hand. Bakugo was waiting for him, cocky grin in place and arms folded arrogantly over his muscled chest. Izuku's smile returned. Ever since the fight between them after All Might's fall, it felt as if things had improved between them, a shift in perspective that shed their interactions in a whole new light. That day, they'd graduated from bully and bullied to true, equal rivals. That, at least, Izuku could trust, because even before the quirk, before Bakugo became unwittingly bound by Izuku's fantasies, he had respected him. You going to make me wait all day? Bakugo taunted, slipping easily into his usual crouched fighting stance, hands out aggressively at his sides and canines sharp beneath demanding crimson. Izuku smiled gently, standing in a much more relaxed fashion. Maybe I should. Then you might learn the value of patience, Kacchan. As Izuku predicted. To be fair, it wasn't like it took a rocket scientist to foresee Bakugo's temper. Bakugo scowled and launched himself forward with a shout, powerful legs propelling him as if he had used his quirk after all. The fight was on and Izuku found himself immediately on the defensive, weathering Bakugo's heavy blows, his mind-numbing speed, his unbendable resolve. Every time their flesh connected, Izuku found himself wincing internally, even as his smile never wavered. Bakugo was as strong as ever. But Izuku had come to a realization not too long ago that had kept him up for one charged, sleepless night. Bakugo was of a slighter build by design. In order to maximize his quirk, he trained himself into a lithe runner's build, a form meant for speed and accuracy. His arms could withstand the strain of his explosions, his body light enough that he could propel himself through the air with ease. It meant, with Izuku's training regimen to bulk up as much as possible to withstand one for all, that there could only be one conclusion. Without their quirks, Izuku was stronger than Bakugo. By a lot. That didn't mean that he was guaranteed to win, however. Bakugo, first and foremost, was a brilliant tactician, even if it appeared to be animal instinct that drove him. Most thought that Izuku knew better. That gave him an edge over opponents, over Izuku, whose analysis, though thorough, took time. So as the blows came thick and fast, Izuku endured them, ignoring the taunts and the jibes, allowing his own honed instincts to take over to buy himself the time he needed to come up with a plan. He could take a beating for as long as it took to wait for an opening. "Fight back, Mother!" Katsuki shouted, landing a powerful kick in Izuku's guard, a blow that would no doubt have knocked him clean out if Izuku hadn't brought his arms up at the last possible second. Izuku only smiled, jumping away to buy himself a few more seconds. Bakugo didn't allow him those seconds. "You think I'm going to go easy on you just because I love you?" he taunted, and Izuku flinched, smile falling in an instant. That was all it took for Bakugo to pounce, throwing Izuku to the floor. Izuku gasped, the wind knocked from him violently, and just barely had time to roll away before Bakugo could pin him. Shaking it and his shock away, he called, "I never expect you to go easy on me, Kacchan," and was instantly comforted by that undeniable fact, even when Bakugo was under the influence. If Izuku could trust anything, it was that he himself would never wish Bakugo to do so, and that made Bakugo's words ring true. He regained his smile, ready for the next round. "Damn right," Bakugo cheered, launching himself back into the fray. They exchanged blows for a time, Izuku long losing track of who landed what. He couldn't tell who was ahead, if either of them, the mat beneath them speckled with sweat from one end of the floor to the other, their arms and chests and legs covered in swiftly blooming bruises that they would no doubt feel in earnest later. "Give up yet?" Bakugo panted when they finally paused for air. His expression was no less determined, but his shoulders were beginning to slump as much as Izuku's, and both of them knew that this would have to end soon. Izuku, with a sudden fierceness he couldn't explain, didn't want it to. Despite its challenge, this was the most enjoyable fight Izuku had ever experienced with Bakugo. It may be because of the quirk that Bakugo's eyes glimmered like that his usual sneer was devoid of any real malice, that even his attacks held more playfulness than the intent to hurt. But even if it wasn't real, even if the real Bakugo would never look at him like that, Izuku didn't want it to end. "Never," Izuku said with feeling, something new and unrecognizable tangling somewhere behind his frantically beating heart. Bakugo's grin widened, eyes glinting with something wild and bright. "That's what I like to hear." Then he was on him. Izuku couldn't rightly recall what happened next. All he knew was that one moment he was preparing his tired body for another attack and the next he was on his back on the mat, a smug Bakugo pinning him with all the entitlement of a cat who'd finally cornered its prey. The both of them breathed heavily, exhausted, their breaths mingling stiflingly between them as Izuku lay stunned and immobilized, once again defeated by his rival. Bakugo grinned, a drop of sweat running down his face and jaw to drop onto Izuku's cheek. The mat was slick beneath him. Izuku's muscles screamed from overexertion. His lungs ached from breathing so hard. But all Izuku could focus on was Bakugo's weight above him, the wild, untamed light in his eyes, and the way he was slowly leaning down into the charged, humid air between them. Izuku's heart kicked into gear when Bakugo's smile finally fell, his eyes sharpening with intent as Izuku didn't push him away. Izuku jerked his head to the side, panicking more than a little. What was happening? What was happening? Why hadn't Bakugo gotten off him already? Alright, why you win? Why wasn't he saying anything? Izuku clenched his eyes tighter, nervous as all hell. You can. Let go of me now. Why? Bakugo said lowly, giving Izuku's wrists a small squeeze. Izuku's breath hitched as he leaned closer, the air coming off of his overworked muscles unbearably hot. What did he mean? Why? The fight was over and there was no reason to be this close. Bakugo rumbled low in his chest and the sound went through every inch of Izuku like the distant call of thunder. Izuku felt the soft press of lips against his neck and he gasped, eyes snapping open in shock. Only to meet the heated, watchful gaze of Todoroki on the other side of the room. He'd laid down at some point, reclining on his side on the bench, head propped on a folded arm. He looked for all the world like he might be napping, save for the unerring eyes locked onto the two of them as if he could stand to watch nothing else. There was a high flush on those cheeks, and even from a distance Izuku could see that he'd been worrying his lower lip, the flesh swollen and pink. As Izuku watched, Todoroki drew it back into his mouth between white teeth. I'll be watching. An amused huff against Izuku's neck had him jolting again. Bakugo relaxed against him, resting on Izuku's stomach, and being pinned started to feel an awful lot like being held. Izuku's eyes fluttered closed as a hot tongue swiped the skin beneath his jaw, licking up the sweat and salt there as if he were savoring his most favored meal. Zuku, you look hot like this. Izuku groaned, hips shifting uncomfortably and heat surging thick and fast at the sound of his name. Bakugo released one hand, not that Izuku was about to move it, and placed it on Izuku's jaw, turning his face to look at him. Izuku did so with some effort, struggling to keep his eyes open, to not give in to nerves, to the delicious weight of the boy above him. But Bakugo's eyes were inescapable, and Izuku found himself unable to deny their pull. Bakugo leaned down again until he could feel the lithe young man's breath over his lips, teasing, just out of reach. Love seeing you like this. How? Izuku breathed, tilting his chin, reason hazing swiftly and refusing to back down. He could feel Todoroki's stare burning him from across the room and wondered distractedly if he'd known this would happen. It only made him hotter, only made it harder to focus on Bakugo's words. Bakugo was going to beep him. He could feel it like fire setting off every nerve in his body because Bakugo was looking at him like that, looking at Izuku in a way that he'd only ever imagined in his most secret fantasies. When Izuku met his eyes with equal fervor, Bakugo's grin widened. Stubborn, even when you're beaten, Bakugo growled, pressing his lips lightly to Izuku's jaw, the corner of his mouth, everywhere but where Izuku wanted him most. Izuku whined and willed him closer, to get on with it already before he did it himself, his back arching from the floor. He could feel the heat of Bakugo's arousal pressing into his stomach and it turned him on even more, until he was dizzy with it. Was this a dream? Had he actually been knocked out and thrown into one of his fantasies? Did it matter? Unshakable, Bakugo continued, with something devastatingly close to admiration, relaxing further until Izuku could feel every ounce of his weight. Beneath me. Izuku froze, eyes snapping open. Just before a triumphant Bakugo could connect their lips, Izuku had a hand on his chest. Wait, he whispered. Bakugo froze, his smile falling as if it had been wiped away. What? He glanced down at Izuku's hand firmly between them, then back to Izuku's face, eyes widening. Get off of me, Izuku said hollowly. Bakugo opened his mouth to reply, but his body was moving before he could protest, removing himself from Izuku's person and sitting on his knees some feet away. What the? He said, lurching up, but Izuku wasn't listening. He lay there, memories and a cold fear flooding him where warmth and desire once resided. Beneath him, Bakugo liked seeing him that way. He always had, though, hadn't he? Izuku closed his eyes, regret for letting things get this far bitter on his tongue. He shouldn't have allowed this. Now he could see why Aizawa forbade them from sparring. Todoroki was on his feet and heading over in an instant. What's wrong? Todoroki demanded, but Izuku couldn't look him in the eye. That's what I want to know, Bakugo said hotly, voice laced with anger. Izuku couldn't blame him, but he was right to push him away. Izuku looked up into Bakugo's snarling face and found the view very familiar. Just like when he'd hurt him for the first time when they were kids and every time after, Izuku on the floor, hurting, while Bakugo scowled from above. "You don't like me, Kacchan," he said bluntly and with absolute conviction. Bakugo might respect him now, but only because he finally got a quirk and proved he wasn't weak, only because he'd refused to let Bakugo bully him any longer. And Bakugo only professed to love Izuku because of the pure bad luck of a misfired quirk. It didn't matter that Bakugo may have behaved that way because of his home life, or how he was raised, or whatever happened. The fact that it did, that he'd never apologized for it or gave Izuku any indication that it wouldn't continue, meant that Izuku couldn't trust the boy in front of him. Not now. Maybe. Not ever. Bakugo would be a good hero, the best. He would do great things, and fall in love for real, and maybe it would even be with Todoroki and they could heal together. Izuku would do whatever it took to help, no matter the cost. But too much had passed between Izuku and Bakugo for Izuku to accept that they could ever have something real. Bakugo blanched, face going slack, before he flushed with rage. "Who are you to decide that, huh? What gives you the right to say that to me?" He jerked forward as if to throw himself right back into the fight they'd just finished, but his feet were frozen to the ground, unable to move. Izuku thought numbly that it might be because, for the first time since all this began, he'd given Bakugo a direct order. Or maybe he really didn't want to attack. Either way, Izuku was grateful. "A year ago, you told me to kill myself." Dead, thick silence wrapped around the three of them, the secluded gym offering not even an echo for their thundering hearts. Bakugo whispered, paling as though he'd been stabbed in the chest. "I did." Todoroki watched with wide eyes, frozen to the spot. Izuku's throat went dry. Bakugo didn't remember. Was it because of the quirk? Or because it had truly been insignificant to him, just another insult, another childish way to hurt? He couldn't decide which idea hurt more. "Yes," Izuku said just as quietly. "You stood over me just like this and told me I was worthless. You told me I would never amount to anything and that I should take a swan dive off the school roof." Izuku's voice broke, but it wasn't as broken as the expression on Bakugo's face. But all Izuku could see was the memories of the harsh words, the beatings, the threats, the burn marks on his clothes. Izuku didn't hold grudges, but he couldn't do anything about the scars. "Do you know, Kacchan? That day, I almost considered it." There was a sharp intake of breath. Izuku didn't know from whom it came. He couldn't bring himself to look at them any longer. Slowly, Izuku got to his feet, the endorphins from his fight long gone and his limbs stone cold. "You can't control how you feel right now, and that's all right. I'll try my best not to get into your way." He smiled weakly at Todoroki, who looked on the edge of some emotion he didn't know how to express. He regretted that the other boy had been caught up in this old pissing match between Bakugo and himself. He'd never meant to hurt him. But at least, with this, Todoroki would know why. "I think I'm going to take a break from school for a few days, at least until this quirk wears off. Then we can all go back to normal and forget this ever happened." Then, Izuku would investigate Shoto and Kacchan's pasts. He would do whatever was needed for them to receive justice, whoever he had to take on, whatever it took to help. Just not this. His heart couldn't take it. Better that he leave now before he fell in love for real. "It's too late for that," a quiet voice in his mind whispered forlornly, but Izuku brushed it aside and gathered his things before heading to the door. "Wait," Bakugo called, and it wasn't the entreaty but the pained way he said it that gave Izuku pause. "I was an asshole, okay. I know that. I don't remember saying that to you, but Izuku sighed loudly, looking to the ceiling and trying his best to not break down. "I admire you, Kacchan, I always have. I even feel attracted to you. But I can't trust you. I don't know if I ever can." "I'm sorry," Bakugo said brokenly. "I don't know why I said it. I don't remember. I'm sorry." Izuku couldn't say how long he'd waited to hear those words he never expected to come out of Bakugo's mouth. He wished Bakugo meant it. He wished it with all his heart, because that was all it would take. Izuku would forgive him. For everything. They could start fresh, and maybe Izuku could leave his scars in the past and they could be something more than distant rivals. It's all he ever wanted. If only he meant it. Then when you do, tell me again. Maybe then I'll believe you. Wait, don't, Izuku shouted, raising his voice for the first time, with a note of command he never dared use with the volatile boy. Bakugo froze, hand hovering just inches away from Izuku's shoulder. Izuku couldn't look at him. Don't follow me. He walked from the gym, leaving both boys behind and feeling like a stake had been shoved into his heart, only to be ripped out again covered in gore. Wait, Izuku, wait, goddammit, I'm sorry. The tears finally overflowed as something broke inside of Izuku. Me too, he whispered. Bakugo screamed, and it was a long time before the echoes of explosions faded behind him. The choice was simple. He'd already been banned from classes and sparring, so it was easy to get permission to take a few days off from school entirely. All Izuku had to do was ask Recovery Girl for a pass, and she gave it easily. In my opinion, all of you kids who participated in work-study should be receiving mandatory leave and counseling, she'd grumbled in that matronly way of hers. Honestly, allowing children to enter a war zone in the first place. I know these are dangerous times, but this is just unacceptable. Recovery Girl gave him a stern stare as she passed the permission into his waiting hand. Get some rest, boy. You look pale. I'll speak with the principal about getting your classmates the same accommodation. Thank you, was all Izuku said, relieved that he didn't have to explain why he wanted the leave of absence. Although he was certain she knew. All the faculty seemed to. Before he could leave the room, the old woman took his hand softly in hers. He stared down at her numbly. Remember that you aren't alone, child. You have your friends at your side and you always have someone to talk to in me if you can't talk to anyone else. Izuku appreciated the sentiment but doubted he would be able to bring himself to. Okay. She gave his hand a tired pat with her old, frail ones before ushering him out the door. Izuku left, thinking about her words. With a sudden, desperate ache, he knew exactly who he wanted to talk to. Fumbling with his phone, Izuku misdialed twice before he finally got it right through his blurred vision. The phone rang and at the sound of an answer, a familiar voice filtering through. Young Midorya, how are you, my boy? Toshinori's kind, tired voice filled Izuku's ear and for the millionth time in the past few weeks Izuku found himself crying. He thought he was over all this crying, but apparently he always had a few more tears to shed. Toshinori-san, he whispered before covering his mouth to hold back the sob he could feel clawing at the back of his throat. What is it? What's wrong? Toshinori said immediately, soothingly, and Izuku could no longer hold himself back. Aye, Izuku gasped, crouching down and trying his best to breathe. Shish, it's going to be all right, I'm here. Tell me everything. Aizawa couldn't have imagined anything like this. He didn't know what he expected, but this was not it. In all the years he'd been a professional hero, there were times when he wished he'd chosen literally anything else to do with his life. It wasn't the fights, or the pain when he lost or got hurt, or even when someone lost their lives because he failed. No, sometimes those who died were the lucky ones. It was the survivors who haunted him, the ones whose suffering didn't end with their rescue. The ones whose afflictions weren't something he could stop with his fists. Ones whose pain went unnoticed or ignored when by all rights they shouldn't have had to suffer in the first place. A young boy lay prone in a hospital bed, hair plastered to his sweaty forehead and slumbering expression pained. Every other breath was a whimper and his eyes moved restlessly behind closed lids. He looked so small and pale beneath the bedsheets, blankets clutched to him desperately as if they could protect him from the nightmares that haunted him. They could not. Black globes hovered over his bed, glowing purple in the wan light and casting him in a sickly pallor. No. Mom, I'll be strong, everyone says I'm strong, he whimpered again, falling silent. Why won't you look at me? He's been like this since he came back from his class trip on Saturday, the boy's father whispered into the dark room. His pale hair pale as his son's hung lank around his face as if he hadn't been taking care of himself. I had hoped that he wouldn't inherit his mother's quirk. I was overjoyed when he'd seemed to develop one all his own, but... Nightmare eaters, Aizawa said lowly, observing the glowing orbs. As he watched, one of them opened a gaping maw and revealed sharp, unforgiving teeth. He remembered this boy. He'd thought his conjurations mere projectiles, and the boy's file said as much, but clearly they were more than any of them knew. Yes, like his mother, he now has the ability to absorb his opponent's worst memories, and like her, he's forced to live them. He closed his eyes, rubbing them with tired hands. When will it wear off? Aizawa said gently. It won't. Either he has to return them, or keep them. In the bed, the boy cried out, tears slipping down his face. Stop. Dad, please. I can't anymore. I can't. His eyes snapped open and he rolled over, retching over the side of the bed. In an instant, the boy's father was by his side, holding his hair back and soothing him with soft touches. When he was done, the child looked at him with hazed eyes and pleaded, "Why can't I go outside and play with the other kids? I don't want to train anymore. His arms gave out and he fell limp, unconscious once more. The man gently helped him back into bed, cleaning his face with patient, trembling hands. Please, Mr. Eraserhead, please help my son. I will, Mr. Murata, Aizawa promised with a heavy heart. He closed the door behind him softly, making his way out of the house on numb feet. This was so much worse than he could have ever imagined. But no, he'd known, or at least suspected. He'd watched Bakugo Mitsuki strike her son and tell him he was weak for being captured, had heard Bakugo say himself that he'd been raised to believe that violence was the only way, that strength was all that mattered. He saw the scar on Todoroki's face and heard about his mother, how he got it. He knew Endeavor was a prideful, harsh man and he could see the hatred in Shoto's eyes when they crossed paths. And yet, he'd done nothing when his students displayed clear signs of abuse. They were at war, but that's no excuse. He would need to think about this carefully and talk with both of them. About the child, who'd unwittingly stolen their worst memories, and about what they should do going forward. Unfortunately, this wasn't their only problem. Both boys had been hit with not 2 quirks, but 3. Aizawa hadn't been idle. After his first interview with Katie, he'd quickly set up interviews with the rest of the children. He could only glean so much of their abilities from their profiles. They were usually tentative until the child reached full maturity and their quirk could be more accurately assessed. What he'd managed to gather so far were 3 possibilities of children with quirks in the manipulation class. Murata Kin, quirk. Mare Eaters, able to take the subject's worst memories onto himself. His quirk also manifested as semi-sentient projectiles. Shino Katie, quirk. Queen Beam, the ability to make her opponent infatuated with the last person they thought about. The inflicted are influenced by their paramour's emotions. And Tanaka Riku, quirk. Obedience. Just like Hitoshi Shinso, he could make a person susceptible to orders. Unlike Shinso, he couldn't give the orders himself. It had to be someone the inflicted already trusts explicitly. The only way he'd found out about the last was through the boy's classmates, who spoke of him with distrust and dislike. The boy was secretive and rarely spoke to anyone, and it seemed, for good reason. He'd been thought quirkless until he'd unwittingly destroyed his parents' marriage, his quirk turning them against each other. He'd been placed in the care of his aunt and uncle at age 6 and was placed in the special needs course soon after. On their own, none of these quirks were particularly dangerous and could be dealt with. But together, they made a harmful combination that could quite possibly be catastrophic. They should have been more selective in who they brought. He should have been more selective, or better yet, outright rejected that lazy Yokumura's idea in the first place. But none of them had thought it was dangerous, not to hero students who were by all rights among the best and the brightest. Yet here they were. Aizawa felt the heavy mantle of responsibility fall on his shoulders, an old, vengeful friend of his. But he didn't have time to feel sorry for himself. His kids were in danger of getting seriously hurt. Aizawa needed to track down the owner of the obedience quirk. There were still a lot of unknowns about its strength and duration, and if it was anyone other than Midorya Izuku that held this power over his charges, then Aizawa would have Bakugo and Todoroki in protective custody until this was resolved. Joke had already done so. Her students were similarly affected by Katie's quirk, though it was still unclear whether they'd been affected by the others. Aizawa needed to inform the faculty about these developments before going any further. Todoroki and Bakugo were vulnerable until this could be resolved, and with both Midorya and Bakugo having been targeted in the past by villains, this could very well turn very dangerous, very quickly. First things first, Aizawa pulled out his cell phone. It rang only once before going straight to voicemail, and Aizawa cursed, listening impatiently to Midoriya's cheerful recorded greeting. Midorya, your hunch was right. Your classmates have been hit with 3 separate quirks. He outlined them quickly, aware that he was running out of time. He would have preferred to actually talk to Midorya, but he needed to find Tanaka Riku and interview him before something drastic happened. Stay together, and don't leave the school grounds. I'll call again when I have more information. The second he hung up, he was dialing again. He had work to do. Izuku's phone hadn't stopped going off since he'd left campus. Most of the notifications were frantic messages from his friends. A few were from Todoroki. None were from Bakugo. All of them went unread. There were probably more, but Izuku shut off his phone a while ago. Slowly, he sipped the tea he cradled between his cold hands, sighing as it warmed his insides. He felt a little better after talking with Toshinori. As always, a single word from his mentor, his idol, was enough to calm him down. Though he hadn't actually been able to tell him much in his distress, Toshinori was able to glean enough to know that Izuku needed an escape. The thin man snored away on his couch, looking as exhausted as ever, and Izuku smiled warmly, so grateful to have him. Toshinori had dropped everything to meet Izuku and bring him to his home, even though he'd been in the middle taking care of Sir's final affairs. Izuku felt terrible that he'd interrupted Toshinori's morning with his silly problems, but Toshinori hadn't seen it that way. You are the most important to me, Toshinori told him, and Izuku didn't think he'd ever felt so loved in his life. It made this terrible situation beep just a little bit less. Izuku's smile fell slowly, eyes drifting back to his cooling tea. He hoped this would all be over soon. With him out of the way, maybe Todoroki and Bakugo could go back to normal and realize their feelings on their own. At least Izuku wouldn't do something he'd regret, wouldn't be forced to watch the love fade from their eyes, only to be replaced by anger and accusation when the quirk finally wore off and they realized how badly he'd taken advantage of them. He still felt their arms around him, the warmth of their affection, and wondered if that too would fade. To his surprise, he found that even if it hurt, he hoped it wouldn't. Their feelings might have been fabricated, but Izuku's were not. It was so frustrating that something like this was going to ruin what relationship Izuku could have had with Todoroki and Bakugo, whether rivalry or friendship. He didn't know which felt worse, that he'd lost all progress he'd made with Bakugo just Izuku'd finally been acknowledged, or losing Todoroki's sweet regard, the boy who wanted more than anything to be called Shoto, who would undoubtedly be hurt when he realized his trust had been broken by someone he considered a friend. Izuku would treasure these memories he'd been gifted with these last few peaceful days and hold them in his heart, a small comfort for when Kacchan and Shoto inevitably turned him away. To be continued. I hope you enjoyed this story. Also remember to subscribe and like this video. See you in the next video.